And reconvene our meeting. All right. Well, I appreciate everybody. Lunch took a little bit longer, but you know, I listened to Mr. Stevenson and realized you guys needed to chew as well. So you're welcome. All right. We're moving on to item number 6 here: discussion and possible action on section 5416D of the Bureau of Cannabis Control's proposed regulations pertaining to delivery. Staff report? Or just move on? No. All right. So this was placed on there because this is an item that cropped up again during the final regs. It's something that I have quite a bit of an interest in from a local government and public safety perspective, but let's go ahead and start a conversation or questions among the members. What do you folks have to say about the proposed regs?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to start. I think I probably agree with you, although you haven't given us your entire opinion, but we're against this regulation in San Jose. From a public safety standpoint, this allows delivery operators to bypass any local regulations. I know that there's concern amongst the community that having a ban on delivery in your jurisdiction bypasses the will of people. But for cities like ours where we allow delivery, but under certain conditions, having a business from another jurisdiction come into our city allows them to violate our local regulations because I wouldn't know who they are, and how they're operating to ensure that they're operating within our local control. And Prop 64 did allow for local jurisdictions to have control over the things happening inside their areas, and while it's unfortunate that people who don't live in cities that are friendly to cannabis delivery, it is something that the local cities have to get on board with. Granted, some are slow to adopt regulations, and that's unfortunate. It'd be nice if everybody adopted quickly to allow for the things that they want instead of just kicking the can down the road, but that's not the world we live in. So just throwing that out there, we've had a couple of instances in San Jose where our local regulations have helped us. We have GPS requirements we monitor the GPS. We have video requirements, secure container requirements, extensive review and inspection of the vehicle prior to being used for delivery. And we wouldn't be able to ensure that those things are happening with vehicles coming from other jurisdictions. We also limit where cannabis can be delivered. For example, you can't deliver to a school. Having the video in the car, we were able to determine that a cannabis delivery did occur at a school. If we didn't have the review of those kinds of regulations, we wouldn't know that that activity was happening in our jurisdiction.
All right, thank you. Any others? Yes. Oh, go ahead, Ms. Nevedal.
Is there any other product that we currently prohibit the delivery of in California? So, I mean, I understand the concern of local jurisdictions, but we also have vast areas that are cannabis and medical islands. They're deserts, right? And so, like, when we don't, my concern is that if we don't allow for licensed delivery services to deliver into multiple jurisdictions, whether they have a delivery program or not, that those patients and those consumers in those deserts, those cannabis deserts, will be forced into the illicit market, and then we will be reducing public health and safety in that manner.
I want to, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I want to echo Ms. Nevedal's comments and just add in that, you know, the intent of Prop 64 and the will of the voters really is to ensure that there's access to cannabis for adults, and previously with the Medicinal Cannabis Act, we want to make sure that there's enough for patients. And by not allowing delivery to these areas, this could really harm potential Californians.
Yes.
I'm going to echo Ms. Yu and also Ms. Nevedal. I think that if you work in the cannabis industry long enough, there are certain areas that are saturated, and then there's other areas where they don't have access to cannabis. And not only that, there are people, I receive multiple phone calls from people who are intimidated. They're afraid to walk into a dispensary, and they're not sure how to do that. And I think delivery answers that, and it also keeps it in the transparent marketplace rather than the illicit marketplace.
All right, Mr. Woolsey?
Just one comment on all three of the previous speakers. Prop 64 does want the public to have access subject to local control, and those are all good reasons why all the local jurisdictions should be moving towards some kind of delivery program in their city, but that doesn't mean that the state should preempt that by allowing, by bypassing the local control that is called for in Prop 64.
Mr. Bilboulian?
A couple of comments on the delivery with the local jurisdiction. I think we can all agree that the bigger bottleneck in the whole licensing process is at the local level, with different cities trying to understand what works for their jurisdiction, what doesn't work for their jurisdiction. The problem with the delivery aspect of it and requiring every jurisdiction to issue a local permit for delivery, I think we can all agree that 80% of the cities are not moving forward with any sort of regulations. And B, when you have a licensed delivery service, that delivery service already has a host city, they already have a host community, they've already gone through the licensing process, they already have a local jurisdiction that has that oversight into their operation. So when the public safety concern comes up, the public safety concern is really no different than having just another vehicle on the highway with $10,000 worth of merchandise in the vehicle, be it merchandise, be it cash. You've got armored trucks on the road where they're a big box truck with we're an armored truck, we have a lot of cash, and those vehicles are allowed to go through different cities without restriction. So if a delivery service, let's say for the sake of argument, starts off in Burbank and drops it off in Glendale, does Glendale really need to have that oversight over the Burbank business? Because at some point those numbers get reported, where the delivery happened gets reported, where it originated from gets reported, everything's reported. So the public safety concern, I'm not understanding it, because it's really just a vehicle driving through a city. You have a situation in West Hollywood, for instance. West Hollywood is going through the licensing process. They're about to issue their licenses. They have a set of licenses if you want to be a delivery service hosted in West Hollywood, and then they have a delivery service license available if you're a delivery service outside of West Hollywood that wants to service West Hollywood. Do you really need quadruple licensing where you got dual licensing in West Hollywood, you have dual licensing in Burbank, and there's really no purpose, because you're not going to split the taxes either. So if a delivery goes from Burbank to West Hollywood, is West Hollywood going to get a cut of the taxes in addition to Burbank getting the taxes? So I just don't think these are regulations that really are a public safety concern. So those would be my comments.
Dr. Cermak?
The law says local control. So are we going to open up lawsuits if we take away that local control? They certainly have local control over whether or not they're going to have dispensaries there. I have trouble understanding what the difference is between being okay with local control of dispensaries, but not okay with local control of deliveries.
I think the local control is really on the business aspect, not necessarily the destination of the delivery. If a person happens to reside in one jurisdiction, but then the delivery is requested and the delivery vehicle originates in a different jurisdiction, that local control is still there in the host community that decided to allow for deliveries out of their community. So this would end up being a situation where it's not really about local control over the business aspect of it, but local control over whether the citizens or residents of that city are allowed to accept delivery of a product. So it's really a consumer thing, not a business thing. And there's nothing that would prohibit that local control, and it's not a local control issue. Because at some point, whatever city ends up licensing that business, they do have that control over it. So it's really regulating where they're allowed, which citizens are allowed to have access to that product and which ones aren't.
My only comment would be, I think we'd spent a lot of time talking about the difference between statutory and regulatory. And I know that 64 did allow for delivery, but it did specifically talk about within a particular jurisdiction. It didn't talk about crossing over to a different local control. So that's the challenge that I feel, is that we can't have it one way and not the other. I think the bigger problem are getting these cities to have allow for a robust cannabis industry within. I hate the idea of one city just allowing delivery and not allowing the other types of businesses to take place. So they can capture certain parts of the industry's benefit, but not sacrifice the other ones that they feel or perceive that the others create. We have a lot of employers, probably in this room, that have invested a lot of money to get permitted in their cities, and did so putting a lot of capital to have, because originally there was no delivery permitted. Spent a lot of money for brick and mortar, spent a lot of money for marketing and doing that. And the way the law looked is that they were going to be okay as long as the delivery came from their own city. How do we justify that these folks who are in cities that have, or counties that have been progressive and trying to look at the entire industry as a whole and making it accessible to everybody, how do we then reward those other cities that are not doing it robustly, or somehow circumventing the challenge being put before those elected officials to do the right thing? Because, frankly, they should be voted out if they're not going to be proactive on doing what they need to do. That's my only thing I'd like.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, ma'am.
this gets to the heart of one of the items I asked for further discussion and inclusion in our report. I think there are some things that would be better regulated by the state. There are things that cause all kinds of hardship on people who try to negotiate local. I'm all for local control, but 58 counties and 400 cities, you're going to get so many different opinions, so many different configurations, and so many different penalties that I think there are some things that we ought to take a look at. Now, this might be one of them in our report, is how do we get the cities and our state congruent so that people in the industry only have one set of regulations they have to deal with, and not everyone different in every city. So I'm hopeful that this conversation leads to the report, the broader issues that I brought up that we need in the report. And I think this is a good example. I think delivery, I travel all across the state, and I don't know when I'm in one city, in one county or the other. I could cross a line, and I could be in San Joaquin in a minute, since I live the next exit from San Joaquin. But I mean, you don't know where these lines are, and many of them might be, some local governments, like you gentlemen sitting here, you wouldn't be sitting here if you weren't progressive. But there's so many others that are not. And so I would like us to put this item on the table for further discussion. And if I don't have to vote on this item, I guess, but if I did, I would vote that we find a way to have a state-issued permit that could go anywhere, like my driver's license can go anywhere in California. And I'm not subject or suspicious of doing something that's illegal. Now, I know that goes in the face of local control, and I know 64 was not written to succeed, because I was there, not quite at the table. But I mean, I just think we ought to have common sense here and try to deal with some. I'm not saying you don't have common sense, because you're smarter than me. But I think we ought to be dealing with some issues on a common sense level, and this might be one of them. I'm not asked to vote, am I?
Mr. Stevenson?
After hearing everyone and being a part of the industry, I believe that when we see pushback from local municipalities about having storefront retail centers, it's from a position of protecting the image of the community, the property values, nuisance issues, and they just don't want it. The counter to that is the deliveries should be allowed to happen anywhere outside of a environment where, like a college campus, because everyone's not 21 or of age, possibly. But in order for this industry to flourish, it can't be choked or curtailed by a few cities or municipalities that just don't want it due to NIMBYism. At some point, we have to allow the market to grow and be what it was supposed to become.
And I respectfully disagree that this is a local control issue. So local control is really about whether or not the locals issue a permit to allow for a state license. And the state license in this case would be issued already. A municipality would have issued a permit, the state would have issued a state license. And local control isn't about whether or not a transporter can drive through a jurisdiction or a municipality to take cannabis to manufacturer, or whether a distributor can drive through a municipality. And I think if we're going to say that state licensed delivery services cannot utilize the public roads to bring that product in a licensed fashion to consumers, we're on the edge of a super slippery slope that potentially is going to start to impact the way we transport cannabis as a whole, whether we're a licensed transporter or a licensed distributor, and I am really uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, I had two more comments on this one. When we talk about local control, this is actually in favor of those cities that don't want it in their jurisdiction, where if we talk about compassion programs, it's all about patient access. And if you've got a jurisdiction that's saying, we don't want to have dispensaries, we don't want to have marijuana businesses there, that's fine. At least you're providing access to the citizens that reside in that community, where they can at least go ahead and order from a delivery service that's in a neighboring county or city.
Ms. Heidelbaum?
I just want to mirror also, again, what Ms. Nevedal was saying, because we have, and I work for the Teamsters, and we've had drivers transporting cannabis who are moving product from one area to the next, where they are moving through a county that they're not allowed, and they've been pulled over and arrested. And I see that that is a major issue for our workers if we are allowing this market and we are telling these people they can deliver this product. And I understand that's a different wheelhouse, but people are moving product. They need to be able to do it without fear.
And I would concur with you on that. I think, part of the problem with our municipalities, I don't think it's just NIMBYism. I think there's a lot of cities, because I've met with a lot of cities, they just don't really know. I mean, we are still been struggling on getting regs right. And I think a lot of them either don't have the economic ability to do their own research and figure out where they want to go with the business, and they're kind of waiting for a template and the state to kind of lead on some of this. And I think once this fleshes out more, a lot of these cities will. But in the interim, I think you're absolutely right on that thing. But I don't want to find ourselves having an issue with statutory versus regulatory. And if I'm wrong the way we read 64, though we may not like it the way it's written, I know there's plenty of things within 64 we may not agree with. I think we're in a difficult spot, same type of slippery slope. If we exempt for one and not the other, I mean, the health issues that were raised by the doctor down here, I mean, we've got to be consistent as a committee, and so that's the only thing I would raise for the Bureau when we go back as a committee, is ensure that the guiding law, or what was passed through initiative, allows us to open it up to cities outside of those that have permitted the business. So that'd be my only thing.
Okay. This has been a valuable conversation, and what it's led me to think of is, since I, as a private citizen, have the right to go to the county next to me and transport a product to my home, it's hard for me to understand why I couldn't have an agent do that for me. And in an odd way, it really might make it easier for those counties who do not want to have retail in those counties or those municipalities, to continue on that without feeling as though they've deprived the citizens of that right to transport into their home, or pay someone else to transport into their home.
So interesting, Mr. Woolsey. I think the topic here, and I'm just going to jump right in on this, is the topic here is local control predominantly, right? I mean, we've been talking about that in regard to distribution and manufacture and all these other types of facilities. But I just wanted to note it's kind of interesting because I'm more aligned with your thinking on this, that the two representatives who actually represent local government seem to be in the minority of the viewpoint of what local government and local control actually means. It's kind of a stunning revelation here.
Yeah, I do find that interesting as well. And to some points, I don't want people to mistake my position. I do believe that people should have access, but if they're living in a jurisdiction where they're banning, that's that community's right to do under Prop 64, is to regulate what happens in that community. If you don't like it, you vote those people out of office and vote new people in, or you move to a jurisdiction that's friendly to your values. So I don't see the issue as a separate issue from local control. It's a local control issue. Localities should be able to determine what happens in their jurisdiction in regards to cannabis as it was passed by Prop 64.
Mr. Chairman?
All right, Ms. Peck.
Yes, I just wanted to say, as far as the tribal piece, is that there's lots of tribal members on reservations that are living on their reservation, but they're living on fee land. They aren't living on tribal trust or trust being held, or the land being held into trust by the federal government. So this is kind of, how do you say, okay, I come to La Jolla Indian Reservation and they say they can't deliver, but they're living on land that they pay taxes to. So I think that this is, once again, tribes are mentioned, but there's not a lot of thought process on what is being said in the regulations.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Stevens.
No, she was,
All right, Ms. Huffman, go ahead.
yes.
I know it's uncomfortable with two of you, good for you being in the minority for a change, feeling like you're in the minority. But I want you to think about people who live in those jurisdictions, that veterans, ill people, all kinds of people that I believe now, although I'll tell you all every meeting, I never smoked a joint, never held a joint, don't know what it feels like, don't want to know what it feels like, but I do put it on my knee now that I'm 82. And I think there are people who can benefit from having it brought into them, and if a jurisdiction doesn't want a license, they certainly don't want to deny people who need the product the opportunity to get it. And I think that's probably what's on the table. It's not local control, because actually I think you guys should just be controlling zoning if you want to ask me, but you didn't ask me my opinion and I didn't get to write that initiative. But it makes sense for you to control zoning and what you want to happen locally, but it doesn't make sense for you to control people's rights to have the drug. And, excuse me, the plant. I didn't say the drug, I said the plant. And I'm learning. But I think that's what we're asking for, is some consideration for people who are being denied the opportunity to enjoy all of the findings and the data that's come out. You listen to the veterans, they believe they will be better off if they don't have to use opioids. If you listen to people who shut in, they'd be better off if they could get delivered to their homes. If you listen to people who are too embarrassed, like me, to go to a clinic, or what do you call them, a dispensary, if I were going to use it, I would want it delivered to my home. And so, you're looking at all kinds of needs that aren't just ego like mine, or deceitful like me if I wanted to use it and didn't want to own up to it. You're looking to people who are shut in, who are ill, who could benefit, and it's not a local control issue. It's a human rights issue. I spent all my life in the NAACP working for civil rights, but you can't tell me the difference in civil rights and human rights, because one line blurs into the other. And if you really care about humanity, you care about your citizenry, Mr. Mayor, what's your title at the local level? Police chief? Sergeant. Oh my God,
Sorry,
Mr. Sergeant.
I'm definitely not the chief.
Then you must want to care about these issues about your residents there. And it's not a power play It's a situation about humanity and people's right to live in those locales where people really don't want to legalize it, to put a plan forth. Then what do those people do? Do you want somebody to get out of the hospital and go across the line to have to get their medicine? No. I'm just,
Stevenson?
Yes.
I'm just talking to be talking.
Ms. Huffman's a hard act to follow. I'd like to state what other commodity does the state regulate like cannabis, where we restrict the activity or the purchase, the legal right to purchase from its citizenry? And, what's next? Are we going to ban high fructose corn syrup? Are we going to say these things? Well, I'm not a consumer of knowingly consuming high fructose corn syrup. But what I like to state is, what other commodity, will alcohol be next? I guarantee you alcohol won't be next because the industry is too large. They have more than enough finances to make sure that doesn't happen. And as a citizen of the state, this really bothers me that we are talking about restricting the end user's choice for purchasing a commodity that's licensed and recognized by the state of California.
Well, here's the other part of it, because when you're in a jurisdiction and there's no dispensary, there's no industry, the local electeds have decided it's not for us in that city. When the patient goes out to a neighboring city, buys that product, brings it back to their house, they've effectuated a delivery. So what difference would it make to have every single patient, or not even patients, every single consumer in a jurisdiction go out, bring it back, deliver it to themselves, as opposed to having somebody that's licensed by the state, has that oversight, has that control, you know what the taxes are, you know what the reporting is. If we've got all these statutory restrictions on particularly compassionate programs, this is the least we can do to have some sort of compassionate program, and it's not even a compassionate program, it's just basic access to the product. Because the other side of it is this: if you're a local jurisdiction, if you're a city, and I'll use Burbank again as an example, if you're Burbank, you're not allowing for an industry, we've got Prop 64, we've got rights to cannabis, you're not allowing, but at the same time, you're also restricting it and you're banning deliveries into your city to your customers, you're kind of trampling on citizen rights to have access to the plant on something that's not really a big issue. We got a lot of other issues: security, internet, availability in remote areas, cities not licensing dispensaries, but then every other city licensing cultivation. Because keep in mind, just like we're talking about protections for businesses, protections for consumers, for patients, for across the board, a lot of these cities are also going to be hurting in about a year or two, because when you look at the market on a national scale, right, every state kind of has their own program, but it's all contained within that state. Here in California, you've got a state program, but then you've also got it separated out into counties, cities, unincorporated counties, and they're all expected to kind of work with each other and interact with each other, but at the same time, each of them functioning as a standalone. We're just creating a massive headache for ourselves in California, making issues where there really doesn't exist any.
Mr. Chairman, are we going to vote on all of these? What's the process?
I think we're going to continue the conversation here for a bit.
I just want to know what the process is.
Well, there's nothing on the agenda to vote on. It's a discussion on this, and then what we're talking about is possible action if someone were to make a motion. But we don't have a motion on the table just yet. Mr. Woolsey, I think we know which way that's going to go. Look, let me give you my perspective real quick from somebody who is, represents local government and also public safety. To comments earlier on public safety, this absolutely is a public safety issue. But it's not unlike other high-risk occupations or high-risk deliveries that occur. I think, anybody in law enforcement recognizes that anybody driving around knowingly with lots of cash or lots of valuable product is a target for crime. It's something we've certainly seen in our region on more than one occasion, and especially as mobile distribution becomes more frequent and more common, we're seeing that type of crime come up quite a bit. So it is a public safety concern, absolutely. From a local control perspective, a couple of things. One is, the question isn't just about local control, but I think it gets deeply to what Mr. Farrow was talking about earlier and having to do with legislative versus regulatory intent. And look, we didn't write the law, right? We didn't write what was voted on by, folks in Prop 64. But very clearly it says local government has its option to ban non-medical business, right? So then it comes down to interpretation, right? And that's where rubber typically meets the road on the regulatory environment. Does that mean that, that includes medical business from a perspective of distribution, mobile distribution, or is it just the purview of having, manufacture, grow, and storefronts, right? And that's an interpretation thing. So is it best left to, a regulatory body like the Bureau to make that decision for us, or is it best to kick that back to the legislature and let the legislature say this is what we think it is? I'll complicate it even further by saying there are local jurisdictions that either as a council have voted on this item and the city council or county board of supervisors have said, no, this is not allowed in our jurisdiction, or they have some hybrid of that. Versus other jurisdictions, Harupa Valley, I think, being one of them as an example, who specifically put this to a vote of the people. So now the Bureau is telling a community and the vote of the people that we're discounting the vote of your community and the sense of your community of what you wanted and what you passed, and we're going to preempt that through regulation, not state legislation. Right? So it's not a simple conversation at all. And I think, just sort of dismissing local government arguments, I think is a significant discredit to a lot of communities who don't necessarily hold the same standards that the folks around the table do. I'll go, again, one further and say, what about the taxing issues, right? So now, the local jurisdictions that are taking on a potential burden of public safety have no tax revenue generated from that product to help deal with that potential burden in public safety. And so they're receiving that without being able to offset, additional officers on the street or code enforcement or whatever it might take to properly regulate that in your local jurisdiction. It creates a new policy outside of the legislative process, to be certain. And we're not, in a lot of cities now, are lining up along this through the California League and others, submitting letters to the Bureau, mine included, saying, maybe this is best handled in a legislative way, because up till recently, that's exactly how it was being handled, right? Nobody was stepping forward in the Bureau or otherwise because there was legislation pending dealing with this at a statewide level. When that fails, then we see a regulatory solution come forward. And that concerns a lot of us because we were tracking that legislation very carefully. And unfortunately, what happens when you take it out of that legislative environment, local jurisdiction then loses its voice entirely, right? We can write letters to the Bureau, but we don't have an actual representative voting on that, right? So, look, if it's the intent of the state of California and the legislature generally, and both the Assembly and the Senate, and the governor signs a bill, then absolutely we'll enact the law, and I know all local jurisdictions feel that way, for the most part. But to place this decision solely in the hands of a regulatory body, a lot of jurisdictions, regardless of what side you come out on this, feel very strongly otherwise. The other things that have been brought up in our conversations, discussions about this, have to do with the decrease of transparency of cannabis operations. And Mr. Woolsey, I think that gets a lot to your point. You have very strict requirements of what you want to see in your city because you have a certain culture and a certain environment in your city. And every city is trying to figure out what mechanism, because certainly, San Francisco is not the same as Murrieta, right? And so we're going to have to create certain mechanisms and certain rules and ordinances to be able to deal with the culture of that community. It does increase the burdens, like I said, of public safety costs. But in a lot of jurisdictions, what it's also doing, and this has been documented in both law enforcement, code enforcement, and then some of the crimes that we're seeing against these kinds of operations, is that these types of operations are becoming, by default, mobile dispensaries in cities that currently have bans on dispensaries. And, you know, despite, I mean, I even had a group come to me after a city council meeting and just full on admit off camera that, yeah, we absolutely drive around with plenty of product in our vehicle, and we operate like a dispensary in your community, even though you have a ban on dispensaries. And I'm standing there, I'm like, well, first of all, why would you tell me that? You know, it's kind of stunning that you're sharing that information with me, but it goes to prove the point of our conversation. I go to Ms. Huffman's comments earlier and say that not every community is blind to, with regard to the health and well-being of our residents. In fact, our city specifically said that we would allow medical delivery, but we reserve the right to ban the adult use deliveries. And it, you know, addresses your issue of health and other concerns. And so it's something that we deeply struggled with. And quite frankly, as a local government representative, I think, you know, a lot of us have sat hoping that, you know, both the regulatory and the legislative environment would resolve a lot of these solutions, because none of us want to have to make these tough decisions. You know, none of us want to restrict people from fairness. None of us want to restrict them from access to medical products. And yet we still have, you know, at least in our community, the preponderance of our residents in a survey that we conducted said, not only do we not want cannabis in our community, but we strongly do not want cannabis in our community, right? And so this is a very polar issue. And so, you know, for those communities who have voted on it, for those who do make these decisions, you know, this is a challenge for all of us. And at the end of the day, you know, I think it's, the question from me and my perspective is, you know, look, I'm not confident that this is a bureau's level decision. I would much rather see it handled at a legislative level. At least then I know that our jurisdiction has an assembly person and a senator that can weigh in on this and provide our perspective. And quite frankly, if, you know, our person and, you know, Mr. Woolsey said it earlier, if they don't agree with us and they have a different agenda and push a different thing, then yeah, there's absolutely an opportunity for us to question them at the ballot. But that's the process as it's been set up. And so I would have deep reservations of you know, seeing this move forward on a regulatory side outside of our legislature.
And since you called out my name, I figured I'd just say, so I just want to make it perfectly clear, access is a huge issue for me, and I only said it because of the issue of the law. My bigger concern is when I look at how people voted in '64, the number of cities whose citizens overwhelmingly voted to support it are still conducting a ban of all types of cannabis. That's the irony of this whole thing, right? Maybe your city does have a bunch of people that say they want it. Our problems would be solved. We wouldn't have to be dealing with these issues if the cities that had overwhelming support for it would have actually opened up licensing for this industry. We wouldn't be talking about it today.
Chairman?
Yeah. So, yes, sir.
I'd like to coin a new phrase as I speak about the issues at hand. I would call these counties odorless municipalities, where they don't want any production, they don't want any consumption, they don't want anything, any commercialized business activity. So that's understood, and I think they deserve that right. However, when we talk about the delivery service itself, I can understand how a municipality wouldn't want an operator driving around with an enormous amount of cannabis, like an ice cream truck, you know, just waiting for someone to order. I think that a fair way to achieve the goal is when a delivery operating service is coming into a municipality that doesn't want delivery, that they can have a maximum of a particular number of deliveries with a manifest attached to prevent just that. And if they want to fulfill more purchase orders, then they have to go back to the locale that they are properly licensed from. And I think that would be a good trade-off. The other issue is when you speak of sales tax revenue, I think the sales tax revenue should always go to the city that the sale was originated from. That way there is no implied complicity with the municipality, like, you know, the one that you represent. And lastly, I think that we need some sort of legal review of what the delivery actually entails for odorless counties or municipalities.
So I just want to respond to some of your comments. I think this is a balancing test. I don't think it's anyone being insensitive to the local issues. I think they're real. I think, there's been a lot of consideration for that. But I think the difference here is that, it is on balance, right? So you have a undefined non-medical business. There's huge amounts of local control, but what really this is lack of access. This isn't about control. I mean, this would be like a municipality saying, we don't want fast foods, right? We're a city, we're banning fast foods. You can't ban the delivery of food to that resident, right? That wouldn't be local control. And so I think if you look at the intent of voters, it wasn't to say you don't have access. And I think it's, a problem to tell people who are going to be the most vulnerable, that need access, that may be housebound, to sell their home? I mean, that's not on balance. So I'm very conscious of the, need for locals to be able to have some control and for the stores and what kind of cultivation. But to basically tell Californians who overwhelmingly voted for this that they don't have access, I think tips the balancing, and where there's not specific legislative intent to make that ban, we shouldn't interpret it that way.
Mr.
Oh,
Chairman?
but, yes,
Uh-oh.
Ms. Huffman?
I'll yield to the captain over there.
Sergeant Woolsey,
Yeah, just,
you keep getting promoted.
I know. Just to comment on where the tax revenue comes from, it should go to the city that originates. But the problem is if you have a delivery vehicle from another jurisdiction where they're getting the tax revenue to help with their public safety efforts, delivering into a jurisdiction that doesn't have a program in place and that vehicle gets robbed there, it's that local jurisdiction's public safety problem to deal with that robbery, and they're not getting any of the tax revenue from the origination of that sale. So that there's a little bit of a problem there. Cities do have options. They can allow delivery. They can be silent on delivery and not ban it, or they can ban it. But what the people voted for was a program that had two components: state level access and local control over what happens in their borders. And on a side note, I just started thinking about some of the public comment that we've been hearing, and I find it interesting that there's public comment saying security requirements for cannabis businesses shouldn't be the same statewide because different communities have different standards on what they need for what makes sense in their community for security requirements. Also, internet video access requirements, other requirements that they want kicked to the local jurisdiction, but then this issue they don't want kicked to the local jurisdiction. So I just find it a little bit interesting that there's a little bit of a disconnect with people wanting a statewide program when it benefits them and a local program when it benefits them. And we just want to implement what was passed in Prop 64, which is localities have the ability to control commercial cannabis activity in their jurisdiction. That's what I'm fighting for. I do believe that a statewide program where everybody has the same access statewide is the best program, and the program will work the best if everybody's on the same playing field, but that's not the system that we put in place. The system that was put in place was a two-pronged system, state and local control, and this particular requirement unfortunately undermines that local control, regulating deliveries that begin or end in their city. And part of Prop 64 clearly said that you can drive through the city. So I can go from one jurisdiction through the banned jurisdiction to the other, because you can't regulate what happens on the public roadway, but you can regulate what happens as far as starting or ending within your jurisdiction. So I'm pretty sure that I know where the votes would land, but I will make a motion that the committee recommend to the Bureau or to all licensing authorities that that particular section 5416D be removed from the regulations.
I'd like to make a couple of comments on that one.
Excuse me.
Oh, I'm
You
sorry.
didn't get a second.
Oh,
I'm going to get parliamentarian here for a moment.
Oh, well, I could always second that. Well, we haven't had an opportunity yet.
He made the motion.
He made a motion.
I'm gonna call you on it. Go ahead.
There's a second, right here.
Who seconded?
I will.
Oh, okay. Go
There you
ahead.
go.
I'm gonna make a
All right,
substitute.
no, and honestly, you know, look, I'm under no delusion that this is going to fly, Mr. Woolsey. I appreciate you holding my hand here, but you know, look, mostly because I think we need to make the point, even if it is a motion a second that ultimately fails, and we get, you know, 2 against whatever, but. You know, point being from my perspective is, you know, again, want to emphasize that this is, I think, most aptly held in the hands of our legislature to make this decision. It was at one point, nobody had an issue with that, and then, you know, that disappeared and we moved on to this process. My deeper concern is, unfortunately, this is going to take a lot of resources and burden onto local government and folks because, you know, look, let's not kid ourselves. Local government and other organizations will be, this is ripe for a lawsuit. You know, and it's falling in a very early part of that process of, you know, both creating a regulatory and a legislative environment to, you know, identify opportunities to make this balanced and equitable process through the state of California. But, you know, you know, don't be, you know, naive to think that, you know, all of the letters that the Bureau is going to receive in the next, you know, several days on this issue aren't positioning themselves and putting themselves on the record for exactly that type of process. And it's unfortunate in my mind because even as a lawyer, I kind of consider any time you ever make it into a courtroom a failure. Because there are always plenty of opportunities to identify a better path forward than litigation. And it's you know, it's an incredible, in many cases, waste of resources and time to do that, and it ties up a system unnecessarily. And so I would much rather see this process play out the way it had been playing out, and maybe the legislation that was pending wasn't the best solution for it, but it was a solution nonetheless. And so I would have preferred to have seen it play out in that manner. So, you know, if we've got a motion and a second on the floor, I'm happy to take that roll call vote, and just so we have that on the record.
We haven't finished discussion, Mr. Chair. You're debating and chairing the meeting.
Oh, I can do both.
Okay.
I still represent
Well,
my
we haven't finished the
position.
discussion.
Mr. Cermak?
I'm convinced by both sides. And that usually calls for a compromise. And I'm wondering whether or not the person who offered the amendment would be willing to accept a friendly amendment to the motion, would accept a friendly amendment saying, exempting delivery of medical marijuana from the motion.
Unfortunately, no, I would not. I think that the cities should have the ability to determine what happens, whether it's medical or non-medical, within their jurisdiction in regards to commercial cannabis activity.
I want to agree with Mr. Woolsey on just that one comment, because accepting a jurisdiction having the authority to say we're going to allow for our citizens to accept delivery, that just basically means whatever is written right now, and that's how it should be. Because there were a couple of comments made about if a delivery vehicle is allowed to go through your city, but just not deliver to your city, how is that any different than a delivery vehicle going through a city that has a ban on it and making a stop for gas, making a stop for lunch to grab a bite to eat? In fact, they'll probably stay longer at a gas station than they would at the person's house. When we're talking about local control, nothing here really takes away that local control, because local control is over commercial business activity. That's not commercial business activity, that's just making a drop-off, because the commercial business activity is happening somewhere else in another jurisdiction. The product, the warehouse, whether it's a vertical business, whether it's a vault, whatever it is, wherever the delivery originates from, that's where the commercial cannabis activity is happening. Everything else, as soon as that vehicle leaves, that's just part of a process. That's not commercial cannabis activity. You're not really taxing that part of it. If we talk about the taxes, it's also one of those things where you can't really have your cake and eat it too. You're either in the business of cannabis as a community or you're not. If you choose not to be, then there shouldn't even be any arguments made about having any access to the tax revenue that's generated, because you just happen to have a city. You just happen to have a resident in your community that needed access and just made it delivery. It's no different than ordering pizza. Not all pizzas that you order come from the city that you live in. They come from neighboring cities. You might want Domino's, but Domino's is 2 cities over. My point is, nothing about the drop-off of that product has anything to do with commercial cannabis activity, and banning it doesn't take away any public safety concerns that don't already exist today. In fact, if we're talking about public safety access, if we don't even talk about any of this stuff, law enforcement now actually has the tools to combat illegal activity, the ice cream truck model, the delivery services, where if a car gets pulled over, if they don't have a manifest, if they don't have an order within that city, they have no business being in that city. And that gives law enforcement the tools to shut them down. If they happen to pull somebody over and they're en route to a delivery and the route matches the route that's in the paperwork and they're just simply dropping it off, again, it's no different than stopping for gas. I don't see where the commercial cannabis activity exists, and this is really not a local control issue because we're not talking about commercial cannabis activity. It's a drop-off. Oh, one more comment. There was also something said about no one had any issue when this was all passed, and a lot of that had to do with the majority of the people that had a stake in that didn't really know what was going on, didn't really know how to participate, didn't know what their involvement could have been. So a lot of them just really went for the ride, voted on it when the time came in November. Now they're understanding it because there's been enough time where they've had to live with the regulations that were passed, and that's why a lot of these issues are being raised right now. Yeah.
Ms. Huffman.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I love you two guys. But I'm going to move that a substitute motion, that we go with the department's recommendation. And if I get a second, I'll tell you why.
I'll second.
No, I move a substitute motion, and I got a second. You have to take my motion. That's what I do for a living now.
I'll do respect, ma'am, but so do I. I just want to check with legal counsel. We have a motion on the table here and a second, and
Well, a
you're
substitute
asking for,
motion
I understand what a
is a higher
substitute motion
motion
is.
than the motion on the table.
Understand
I
that.
didn't amend his motion, I substituted his motion.
And I'm just asking legal counsel for her opinion
You know I
on
love
that.
you.
Thank
Go
you very
ahead.
much.
She might want to agree with you, but she better not.
Well, I think the committee actually's handbook says that, you know, you can refer to Robert's rules, but it's not a strict reading of Robert's rules, so that would, how you want to proceed would be the decision of the chair.
Correct, thank you. So, that said, Mr. Woolsey, I think we're out of this one.
If there's a way to have public comment on both the motion and the substitute motion at the same time so that there's not 2 sets of public comment,
I think
that
you
would
have
be
to
helpful.
defeat the substitute motion, then go back to the original motion. That's my
I don't know
recommendation.
anything about that process. That I got to leave that up to you guys.
I got a feeling we're going to get public comment across the board, so.
Yeah, no problem on that one. So we have a substitute motion. I understand what you're trying to accomplish. I was seeing if there's any other comment from our members.
Second is over here.
Well, I
We have
want
a
to speak to my
motion and a
substitute
second.
motion, if that's proper.
That's fine.
I'd like to point out to all the committee members here, this is not a struggle of power. The proposition was passed by the voters of California. The League of Cities that represent you all was at, not you, but represent the mayors was at the table. That's why you have so much latitude, is because the proponents worked very hard to make sure that the League of Cities was represented. And I think it's sort of like, Police chiefs, I know. That's why, anyway, you know, this is sort of like deja vu. You know, when you have so many entities trying to make a decision about what's right, that so much stuff gets lost in the transaction. And so I don't want to go back to discrimination in Alabama and Mississippi and all those people that didn't want to follow the law of the land that created such a hardship because they wanted local control. But this is local. Local control is not the epitome of advocating for human rights. Local control is advocating for bureaucracy, for power, and not for people, even though you represent people. And so Mr. Chairman, there's some call over there in the legislature rolling over the chairman. We don't want to roll over the chairman. We love you. But we need to vote down your recommendation and vote for what's right. And that's why I put the substitute motion on the table. You guys could withdraw your motion. And make us all happy.
I want us to just be a little bit careful with our words here because, you know, again, local control is not just about control and bureaucracy. It is about representing the people. I've been elected by a body of people, 113,000 of them. And so let's not forget that that's what I'm supposed to be representing in all my decision-making capacity. So I absolutely am aware, and I would argue that we're one of the few communities that actually stepped out to actually poll our community, to take the pulse on what's important and what our ethic is. A lot of councils and supervisors around the state have gone ahead and made decisions absent that. So we're very much aware of that. And we've had more public workshops than arguably most cities. In fact, we hosted a regional workshop well over a year ago to discuss these issues and bring in experts from not only California but other states. And so we're very interested in representing our constituency and the folks there and doing it as balanced and fair as possible.
I was careful because I did not want to make it sound like we were opposing you in your city. I tried to put a little humor in, tried to make it a little light. Didn't mean to be accusatory, but I have lived through local control. And local control for my people, I'm just speaking for my people. You got your people, I'm gonna speak for my people. Has never worked. And so I just want to be sure that when we're talking about local control, that we put the issue on the table of what it is. It's power. When we're talking about people, we're talking about humanity, people's rights, and people what they deserve. And so I didn't want to make this a me and you and your city and mine and civil rights and all that stuff that I lived through at 82. But I do want to tell you, Mr. Mayor, I know you represent your people, but your people might not represent the voters who voted for this initiative.
And I think that's kind of my point is, you know, every community had a different ethic on why they voted and what they did. And to be honest, one of the things I've seen in our community is that, you know, if you looked at our precincts, unlike the state of California, we did pass, you know, Prop 64.
I think that's
by
why you're here.
only a
And
couple,
that's why he's here.
but only a couple hundred votes, right? Not an overwhelming and not 60% and not the way you know, some communities around the state did. And so that placed us, I think, in a very challenging position because when you do poll our community, when you do talk to folks, you know, and not surprising up and down the state, people are very divided on this issue. And so you're walking a tight line in some communities, especially ours, where you're basically a 50-50, you know, and we tip the scales just barely. And so how do you fairly represent that? It's a challenge for us.
Well, how do you fairly represent this committee that is set up to implement 64?
Well, we're not here to implement 64.
Well,
you know,
we are to recommend on implementing
we're here to
64.
advise the Bureau and the related agencies as to, you know, we don't set the regulations, we just advise. And so, you know, I think myself and Mr. Woolsey are giving one bit of advice saying, you know, hey, our perspective is this. You know, everybody else has a separate perspective, and the Bureau takes that forward in you know, whatever you know, sense you need to.
Mr. Chair?
But it's certainly not an easy thing for us to you know, sit here and talk because we are going to have different perspectives, and we've seen that throughout this conversation from the very first meeting we've had.
I respect
you
that.
know, and so I'm hoping that, you know, part of the thing, and I want the public to understand this too, is that as you're coming up here, and I know a lot of the comments tend to focus on, you know, the regulations and people's comments very specifically, you know, address a certain item or a certain thing in the regulation. You know, again, you're speaking to an advisory committee, not the regulators themselves, right? And we want to sort of re-emphasize that because I think a lot of times folks come up here thinking that you're talking to us and then we're taking that into consideration to create regulations. That's not true. These are the folks that are dealing with the regulations, right? And in fact, you know, one other concern I have is that some folks come to these meetings talking about the regulations, talking about some of the concerns that they have, and not recognizing that what they're saying, well, this is all part of, you know, the public record. It's not part of that administrative record for official comments on the regulations for Prop 64. That meeting is on the 27th here in Sacramento. And so, you know, you need to make sure that, you know, while we're definitely here to listen to you and we appreciate all the discussion, robust, you know, conversation that we do have, you know, let's make sure that you're not under the impression that what you're doing here is, you know, going on the official record for the regulatory process, because that's a separate set of meetings altogether.
Mr. Chairman,
I'm sorry, Mr. Sweeney was next, yes.
I recognize that we have audience participation, and what I would like to do is request after that audience participation that we take this to a vote. I'll simply say reasonable minds may differ, and so we do have a way to resolve our differences, and that is through the voting mechanism. And so I would suggest that we utilize that mechanism when it's appropriate after we hear comment.
Okay. Dr. Cermak.
I was going to say essentially the same thing. I believe there's a possibility there's some comment from the people who are here, and I'd like to get home before midnight, so.
Absolutely, me too. Mr. Baboulian?
Yeah, one more comment. On the polling, it was interesting that you brought that up, Mayor Ron. The polling of local residents, in your city, it happened to fall 50-50. When you put it out for a poll, see the Prop 64 polls, Prop 64 votes, when you break it down based on jurisdiction, you kind of already know where each jurisdiction stands. When a city goes out and polls the community again to see whether or not they're favorable, that poll is usually for, are you guys interested in having a commercial cannabis program set up within our city? That's where you will see a difference between what people voted for on Prop 64 at the state level and what people will vote for at the local level, whether or not they want the business of cannabis in their community, be it cultivation, be it manufacturing. So I think it's great, it's very proactive on behalf of the city, but I think it's not really apples and oranges, where if you do your poll and the poll comes back saying, no, we don't want it in our city, that's fine. What about the percentage of people that voted for 64 that do want access to it? And then when we start getting into, well, now we, as a city, as a local jurisdiction, if you get into the banning of deliveries and who can access and who can't access it, that's kind of along the lines of also saying no cannabis in our community, whether you're consuming it, smoking it, or any of that stuff. So I just did want to highlight the difference between the percentage of your local constituents that vote for Prop 64 that want access to it, and then the percentage that vote on it through a poll, whether or not they want the business of it there. So,
Understood. Okay. Okay, so Ms. Huffman, can you just repeat the motion, just so we're clear?
Yeah, substitute motion was that we.
Oh, you got to turn on your mic, sorry.
I was trying not to speak again, Mr. Chairman. Substitute motion is that we honor the report that was given to us and vote to send it forward.
Okay, thank you. Open that up for public comment, please.
Public comment will begin. I'd ask anybody that wants to speak on this motion to line up behind the seats, and we'll take an open seat when it becomes available. Speaker number 1.
Rich Miller, Placer County, where the complete supply chain is banned. I also live in the city of Auburn, where delivery is banned. I'm lucky. I work at a dispensary. I have access to my medicine as a patient. But so many of the patients that I deal with in Auburn do not have access. A young lady at 74 years old in a wheelchair with Parkinson's disease cannot get delivery to her community, and I cannot bring it to her. It's about access. And in my opinion, if there is no access to community, it's not access to the state. With so much of the state denying access, we need our delivery. As was stated, with businesses being affected with the brick and mortar and delivery, there's a big enough slice of the pie for everybody. As far as public safety is concerned, like pizza delivery started out early on in the industry, they were robbed. People are going to take advantage of the people, but it's the responsibility of the people to make sure of their surroundings, because I think that delivery service will decline as far as robberies are concerned. If there is no delivery service, there is no footprint in that city, then there is no need for a ban. Delivery should be controlled by the city which they are located, not by where the delivery service is made. We must think of the compassion of the patient, the access of the patient, the humanity for mankind, and the morality to safe access.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Speaker number 2.
Hi, once again, Katie Maple, here on behalf of We Drop and the California Cannabis Couriers Association. To date, there have been 1,367 letters of support for this regulation submitted to the Bureau. Simply put, we do not believe local governments can legally prohibit home delivery. In no other circumstance does a local government have the authority to ban a legal consumer product from being delivered to the privacy of someone's own home by a licensed business, so it's unclear why cannabis is any different. Prop 64 does give local governments the ability to utilize land use authority to restrict which businesses can be licensed and open up shop within their boundaries, and that remains the same under this regulation. I want to be clear about what's at stake here. That is safe access for patients and consumers and the viability of the regulated market as a whole. With more than 3/4 of cities and counties not licensing retail or banning entirely, there is disruption in the supply chain in which producers cannot get product to market. Meanwhile, due to lack of local licensing, many Californians live great distances from the closest retail location, meaning those who physically can't move, don't own a vehicle, can't afford a caretaker, or don't have the time or resources to spend hours on public transit are the ones left out, and those are the ones that need it the most. Lastly, while we spend our time here debating who has control in the name of public safety, we have all played directly into the hand of the illicit market. The reality is consumer demand is there regardless of whether or not local governments choose to license. We have the opportunity now to decide whether that access will be safe, tested product from licensed businesses and produce those tax revenues. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 3, please. Speaker number 3.
Yes, I think I got the solution to your concern for your city. You have dispensaries in your city. They can deliver outside of your city, just like any other dispensary is doing. That will bring revenue to the city. For those who are delivering outside the city, that city gets that tax on that delivery. So I'm quite sure your dispensaries would not have a problem delivering outside of your city to any other city outside, because that's what, the cities can do. So I think that would solve the issue, and you get more tax revenue. And then secondly, on my comment, delivery locations, it's our understanding that when you put a product to deliver, all that product must have an address to deliver to. And I was thinking someone might have made a comment that you don't want people driving around with cannabis. That's not the point. And we got GPS tracking, so if I have 10 customers to deliver to, my manifest is gonna have that. And we're gonna GPS track you. So you'll come back and pick up more, and you would only pick it up unless there is a customer to take it to. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Naprawa. I'm a public health attorney with the Getting It Right from the Start project at the Public Health Institute. My point I'd like to make is that changes to state law cannot happen at the regulatory level. California Professional Business Code 26200A1 assures that a local government is able to completely prohibit the establishment and operation of a cannabis business. The proposed regulation strips local jurisdictions of that authority because it forbids them from blocking the commercial sale via delivery of cannabis to locations within their jurisdiction, which is against the plain language and intent of the state law. That this interpretation of 5416D is correct, and that it conflicts with existing law is further illustrated by the failure of SB 1302, which similarly sought to undermine local authority on jurisdiction and failed to achieve the required 2/3 vote. California courts have previously determined that local jurisdictions have the authority under their police power to institute tighter restrictions than are issued under state law, particularly in matters involving public health. We've seen this in tobacco regulation. Based on current state law as it is currently in place, the autonomy of local jurisdictions to regulate whether and how cannabis can be distributed and operate in their jurisdiction must be respected. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
Hi, good afternoon. Susan Tibbin. With regards to delivery in what are essentially dry counties or dry cities, consider a real-world example that we ran into last week. We chatted with a mother whose 12-year-old child has a very aggressive carcinoma. The child under the care of his pediatrician and the family, has been using medical cannabis and has managed to achieve stasis. He has outlived his diagnosis now by quite a number of years. So should this family relocate in order to obtain medical cannabis since it's unavailable in the area they live due to local control? Should they move to Colorado the way families did in past years? Well, that wouldn't really matter because medical cannabis is 90% unavailable in Colorado, and California is following suit. That's a little bit of a different issue. But bottom line, the state of California, the citizens of the state of California past 64, and all people should have ready access to this medicine, particularly people in this situation. It is our moral imperative to make it possible for this child to survive.
Thank you.
Please. Thank you.
Speaker number 3.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the board for even putting this item up as you have. You've taken a bold step against the City of League of Legislators, of local legislators, and I understand the position it's put y'all in as far as sitting in between lawsuits and being sued. So I understand that. I definitely am for delivery. I'm a medical refugee myself. As the lady just mentioned, what are you going to do? Move? I did that. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. My business that helps out other people and other patients like myself, everything I can do is not going nowhere. And I'm going to get it to them via delivery. I'm getting medicine to them. Recreational, I'm not a big fan of because of what it's done to medical. I started at Oaksterdam in 2010. I put my college education into this. I see it as a science that I lost whenever I stopped pre-med because it seemed to be more political in how many people I can flunk in a class. So it's brought me back to science, and zoning is local control. There's your local control. As far as denying an opportunity, it's simply a prohibition. It's denying an opportunity that's been voted on. This is medical. People that are depressed, people that are homebound in their homes, they can't get to the medicine. Delivery allows that access.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
Hi, I'm Ellen Comp from California Normal. We also agree there does not need to be a legislative fix on this. It could be handled through regulations. Consumer deliveries do not fall within the traditional constitutional powers of local governments to regulate land use. Proposition 64 specifically codified Business and Profession Codes 26080B, which specifically forbids local jurisdictions from preventing transportation of cannabis products on public roads by licensees. Given that local governments are already required to accommodate licensed transportation of cannabis, there exists no argument on public health or safety grounds that residential deliveries pose unusual risks to the community. Any extraordinary powers conferred on local governments under Proposition 64 do not apply to medical cannabis, only adult use. This is clear from the purpose and intent of the law. There exists no jurisdiction or precedent for allowing local communities to ban the delivery of medications to residents in their jurisdictions anywhere. I think that sales tax ought to be paid by the person who, in the jurisdiction that makes the sale. When I sell T-shirts in a different county, I have to pay to that county, and that way that county can recoup it. They're ripping themselves off for the person who has to go to another county to buy the cannabis. Let's fix this on the regulatory level. Thanks.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
Yes, hello, Adam Villarreal, Dragon Manufacturing. I wanted to speak a little bit to what the chairman had said about more of the humanistic side. A lot of people here have made excellent, very concise arguments pertaining to specific pieces of legislature, specific codes. What seems to be going on here is an issue of cannabis exceptionalism. No other product is regulated like this. And if you want to drive a truckload full of pharmaceutical medicines into a town and drop those off, that can be worth millions of dollars, and we're here fighting about something that's a fraction of that. You want to talk about matters of public safety. By driving people into the illegal market, you're now forcing medical patients that can be on several grams a day to use illicit concentrates where the concentrations of microbutanol can be so far off the charts that it becomes literally a toxin. This isn't an issue of local control, this is an issue of access, as has been voiced by not only members of the community, but members of the audience as well. You're going to tell me that something bureaucratic is an issue of, well, we as local legislators don't like exactly how this is going, so that makes it worth people who are underprivileged and can't get themselves out of bed to be denied access to their medicine. And we can say in practice, you know, that's not the law, that's not how it's supposed to be, but that is what's happening out there in the streets. And I would urge you to consider this. Thank you.
Speaker number 3.
Mr. Chairman and members, my name is Andrew Antwi. I'm here today on behalf of the City of Beverly Hills. We are opposed to the provisions in the draft regulation, specifically Section 5416D. The City of Beverly Hills believes that these draft regulations go beyond the intent as stated in Proposition 64. We think that the purpose of this advisory committee is to provide input to the Bureau of Cannabis Control on interpretation of the statute. You guys don't have this authority, and you're going beyond it, and we believe that this will be challenged legally. Local jurisdictions like Beverly Hills actually already allow the delivery of medical cannabis. If you're looking for legislative intent, then the failure of SB 1302 Laura to move out of the House of Origin is a pretty good signal. Beyond that, there's been years of prior legislation enacted by the legislature that also signal that this is something that the legislature has restricted to its purview. So for those reasons, we urge you not to approve this language, to delete it from the proposed regulations. And for that, we ask you to go ahead and adopt regulations that do not allow this provision to override local ordinances that set policies at the local level.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
Thank you. Max Michelos with K3 Consulting on behalf of the California Cannabis Delivery Alliance, here in support of the Delivery Freedom Regulation 5416D. One thing that we want to go back to that's been talked about here is access versus local control. And with access, we're referring to really the individual rights under Prop 64, Health and Safety Code 11362.1. And those rights say that it shall be lawful, and this is paraphrased, shall be lawful under state and local law and shall not be a violation of state and local law for persons 21 years of age or older to possess, process, transport, purchase, or obtain cannabis, within certain limits. That is a paraphrase of it, but 11362.1 of the Health and Safety Code. So what we're arguing here is that there is a fundamental right under Prop 64 that the cities would be infringing upon by prohibiting delivery in those jurisdictions. The case law around delivery ban or around cannabis bans has solely been based in land use policy, and those were the City of Riverside versus Inland Empire Patient Center and other cases that were pre-MRSA and MCRSA, but they were entirely insisted on the land use authority to go and regulate and license businesses in your jurisdiction. Local control is still being respected because all businesses doing these deliveries would still be licensed and regulated. Lastly, you are not banning cannabis delivery. You're banning legal, taxed, regulated cannabis delivery that's safe for the consumer. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
My name is Jackie McGowan, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself as a patient today. I live in Sacramento, and I drive to Oakland once a month to get these 2 little packages, and that round trip, along with my time in the dispensaries, takes me about 4 hours. I look forward to the day where I don't have to deliver my cannabis to myself, but I'm also grateful that I can actually make that trip, that I'm healthy enough to do that. I looked on the League of Cities webpage to see if there was an official definition of local control. There is not one, but the best that I can sort of ascertain is it's the ability of local governments to determine for themselves the governance structure of said power. So I don't think that we are usurping any sort of local control by, as Mr. Boulbion's analogy of getting a pizza delivered has been used. I really do look forward. I've done this drive for the last 3 years of my life, and it would be a lot easier if my manufacturer could deliver that to me. There's been a lot of talk of local jurisdictions moving forward with regulating, and I think that Mr. Ron's talk of being the mayor of Temecula and admitting that your jurisdiction did pass Prop 64, but you have a ban in your city. Just allowing medical is not what Proposition 64
Thank you.
was intended to vote for, so thank you.
Speaker number 3.
My name is Ann Kelson, and I'm speaking on behalf of the California Compassion Coalition and also several delivery service clients. The more and more I've sat back and heard different responses today and heard different points made, the more troubling I think it is when we actually look at the realities on the ground. Local ordinances spell out how to get a license for a business that's going to be incorporated, headquartered, operating, paying taxes in that jurisdiction. They don't actually reach into what's happening in reality when a customer is receiving a delivery. That's spelled out actually in the state laws. It's very clear in the regulations what kind of customer information is needed, how many deliveries need to be made before that vehicle can actually go on the road and leave. So contrary to what one speaker said, delivery services are not mobile dispensaries. There is currently in the regulations that are in operation a limit to how much cash can be carried. That has changed in the draft permanent regulations, but there's still a limit. There's also a limit to the amount of goods, of course, and even what a route might look like. These are all state rules. And in addition to that, the rules on receipts, invoices, confirmation of whether or not the customer is 21 and up, all the different things that happen in that transaction with that customer, those are found in state rules. They're not found in local ordinances. In fact, I would challenge someone to come up with it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaker number 1.
Hi, I'm Joseph Aroni from the Sweet Leaf Collective. We provide free cannabis to low-income terminally ill patients. I'm here representing patients who are housebound and unable to actually come here and present their viewpoint. This is an issue of patients' rights and patient access. It is not okay to require terminally ill patients with mobility issues to travel hours to go get their medicine from a county where it's not banned. Currently, 2/3 of the counties are banned. And this is a major issue for patient rights. These people already have enough troubles in their life just trying to deal with cancer, HIV, AIDS. Can we please help them out a little bit? I don't think that this was the original intention with all these laws and the passage of Prop 64. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
Hello, everyone. My name's Dan Georgiadis. I'm counsel for Purple Lotus, commercial cannabis licensee in San Jose. I would just like to make some observations on this healthy debate. There is the competing interest here with the lack of access and wide bans from the municipalities all over California, and there's also the interest of local control. I just want to point out Business and Professions Code, Section 26,030, Subdivision F, the licensing authority can discipline anybody that fails to comply with a local ordinance, according to that code. If the locality has an additional requirement, such as video cameras in the delivery vehicle or less of a limit on what you can carry within your car, and they get pulled over by the police and they're educated on those requirements, then you're subject to you're subject to a misdemeanor for failure to comply with the ordinance, and you better report that to the BCC within 24 hours. I would suggest a sentence on the end of Section 5,416, Subdivision D, that says if delivering to a jurisdiction that regulates and permits commercial cannabis delivery, then that commercial cannabis licensee must comply with that local ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 3.
Hi, my name is Michelle Dzitzer, and I'm the owner and founder of Cannabis. Our business is a personalized subscription box, and our goal is to help individuals figure out what best cannabis products work for them. And the whole idea is that everyone reacts differently to cannabis, whether you're a medical user or a recreational user. At any point, a recreational user could become a medical user. And there's so many different products out there, and we want to make sure that a brand, whether it be small or large, can access any consumer. So we also wanted to say that accessing a consumer is not operating in that jurisdiction. So we want to make sure that patients and consumers can access cannabis no matter how small the brand is and no matter how that person is using the medicine. Also, we also wanted to say that before Prop 64, accessing cannabis was easier than it is now. And I think that was not the point of passing Prop 64. The point of passing Prop 64 was creating a more accessible, safer way to access cannabis. As Dennis Perone once said, we are all patients whether we know it or not. Thanks.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
I want to thank the commissioners for wrestling with these topics over time, and you know, many of you talked about compromise, and I think Malcursa is a great compromise on this subject. It seems that Malcursa speaks to this, and after I've read it 100 times, I feel like Malcursa allows for local control of the businesses and and controlling the origin of a delivery, but not where it might travel through and not where it might land. And I think we should stick to that. The ability for local jurisdictions to control land use is enshrined in California law, and it works really well. And we should let the local jurisdictions control the commercial businesses, not consumer access, not patient access. And there's an imperative to make this work in California. California is the nation leader on this. We could be the global leader on this. And to end up with a weird checkerboard up and down the state only prolongs the misery. So please, I encourage the committee to interpret this as Malcursa. Thank you.
Speaker number 2.
Good afternoon. Dale Schaefer. I'm on the State Compassionate Coalition. I'm also attorney for Weed for Warriors. And I've had this argument with county council all over the state. I think we can look to the enabling statute, which gives immunity while delivering on public highways. I think that's the answer to the question. It caused a lot of fights. This clarifies that, just to make sure, to Alice's point, Billy Bob and Ted Rex don't get to do what they want to do when the state law says something different. Now, I'm also in the middle of this compassion problem, and it's easy for me to call up Weed Maps and get a delivery everywhere in this state. And so if you don't find a way to make this work, the black market, unregulated market, whatever you want to call it, will win. It's winning right now. We have the enabling statute to allow this. It is needed. Compassion cannot go forward without this. And we are going to be enabling the unregulated market to continue to win if you don't allow this to be what it is right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 3.
Good afternoon. My name is Eliza Maroney. I am here speaking on behalf of the California Cannabis Couriers Association, as well as my own business, Lucky Box Club, a premium cannabis subscription service as well. As a newer member to the cannabis market, I am really, first of all, very grateful that you all are taking the time to actually hear our thoughts. And I am here also speaking on behalf of my father, who is a disabled veteran. He is a double amputee who could not drive himself here today, not only because he can't drive, but because he doesn't have the funds to pay someone to drive him to be here. That is something that we need to take into consideration because it's not just physical limitations, but also fiscal limitations that people have when it comes to accessing cannabis. Paying for transportation to and from a dispensary costs money and time, and oftentimes for somebody with heart failure as well, you know, it's exhausting. So I encourage you and implore you to really take that into consideration, as well as on the delivery side, understanding that those lines are very blurred when it comes to knowing what the county lines actually are, and there's no clear and concise way for us to operate under these current regulations if we decide to get rid of the point B there. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
Hi, Sergeant Woolsey. We always take offense when someone calls us a captain when we're enlisted, so I apologize for those offensive comments that people made. Mayor Ron, this is for you and our friends of the OCW. Hello. My name is Sean Kernan, and I help run the Weed for Warriors. I would like just to give you an enlisted veteran's perspective, because I'm unaware of anyone on this panel who was an enlisted veteran. I could be wrong. The League of Cities is upset at the BCC's regulation opening up delivery to any private residence because of two competing interests that have joined forces, if we're to be honest. The League of Prohibitionists and the League of Profiteers. We are losing at least 20 veterans a day to suicide and a like number to overdoses. Cannabis is the only medicine out there that is showing a statistically significant link to reductions in both. Denying that medicine to those who fought for all of us is conscionable and raises the bigotry of prohibition again. While corporate cannabis absolutely puts a price on the lives of our veterans to increase their profit margins. We are here today to highlight and memorialize those who vote for bigotry and profit over our brothers and sisters' lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
Hi, Paul Hansberry. Mayor Rahm, you mentioned how many thousands of people had voted for you. There were other people that did not vote for you, and those people need to be accounted for as well. As far as local jurisdiction and having your own delivery, a jurisdiction could have a requirement that requires an armored truck with 2 armed guards in order to perform a delivery. So someone from another jurisdiction would have to hire an armored car and 2 armed guards to do that. It seems a little unreasonable. And in order to get access to the medicine that people need, I think that we're on the right path here. We're allowing them to stop if they're allowed to travel along the road. The commercial entity is where the license is granted in that premises, and it's not taking away from the local jurisdiction. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Speaker number 3.
We've been throwing out numbers here all day. California represents 2 million veterans. It's the leading state out of the whole nation. And you hear the number 20, they say 20, 22 veterans committing suicide a day. It changes. The statistics not correct because the data is not complete. But what I have to say to that is that veterans only take up 7% of the national population. And we count for over 20% of the national suicide rate. People don't look at veterans as minorities, but we are actually a minority group. We're different from everybody else. We're black, white, Asian, brown, yellow, doesn't matter. We're veterans of veteran. We're all green. If you do not allow access, and I do applaud California, our opiate overdoses are lower than most states, and that is because right now they have access to cannabis. Cannabis is proven to lower suicide statistics, being proven to lower opiate addiction and overdoses. And by shutting off access, we are strapping veterans to pills. I can go to the VA and get as many pills as I want. They mail them to us. Mail, FedEx, UPS. I am a veteran suicide survivor. It was because somebody introduced me into cannabis and former federal law enforcement. I've protected Obama twice, I've protected Bush, I've protected Cheney. And it took my suicide for me to say, hey, I need to try something else. And it was a delivery service that brought that cannabis to me.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
Thank you, panel, for your efforts. I realize as the state makes these baby steps towards legitimize this medicine and economically valuable resource to our state, that your efforts are not easy, and I appreciate them. I represent a collection of investors in the tens of millions of dollars. What we have witnessed this last week is Corona Corporation had invested $4 billion into the Canadian market. Our citizens behind us are all motivated to make this a legitimate economic and medicinal component of our state. We are absolutely correct that California can lead the entire world in how this long-held historical chemical can be utilized by citizens peacefully and to the reduction of illness.
What I'm concerned with specifically, although many valid points have been raised by everybody, is the actual websites, both by the California Bureau of Cannabis Control as well as the California District of Agriculture, do not have a reliable way to find compliant growers, distributors, to my investor group's satisfaction. Without an easy way to both legitimize growers and distributors' efforts to get compliance and to search for compliance, we are sacrificing investment funds. Thank you for your time.
Okay. So, any other discussion? We have a motion and a second on the table by Ms. Huffman and Mr. Babulian, I believe. Mr. Cermak?
I just want to note that I'm unwilling to vote for either of these because I haven't heard a compromise which will both pay respect to local control and make sure that compassionate use can be delivered.
I'll make a comment on a proposal for a good compromise. Local control for any municipality that wants local control as far as setting up the businesses, collecting tax revenues, they've got that, nothing's taken away from it. Allowing for state licensed deliveries that allow delivery across jurisdictions doesn't take away that local control to set up the business. It provides for patient access, and I think it's a phenomenal compromise.
Chair. I'd like to say one of the compromises that just came to my thought is if the municipality that doesn't want to have delivery brought into the area is not in a position to deny it, then they can tax it at the rate that they want. Now, I'm not a proponent of tax, but I do respect the position of these communities. And it could be a tax where, you know, no one can really say that it can't be there, but, you know, they're in a position to determine if this does occur, what tax rate they want to tax this activity at.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect to the doctor and everybody else who's spoken, compromise is a act that has giving on both sides, and sometimes a compromise is not possible because right cannot be compromised. And what is right is right. And so while I'm with the doctor most of the time looking for a compromise, I think in this issue, I'm going to ask the committee to sustain the report that came from the agency because what is right is right. And it doesn't have a color on it. It doesn't have, you know, I can do my racial thing, but that's not it. It's about people who are in need and doing what's right. And so I'm going to ask the committee to vote aye for the substitute motion.
Can we just clarify that motion, Ms. Huffman? That is that for the committee to make a recommendation to keep this provision?
Yes.
The 54-160D? Okay.
Any further discussion? All right, seeing none, can we have a vote, please?
Babulian?
Strong aye.
Cermak?
Nay.
Sorry, can you repeat? Can you repeat, Dr. Cermak?
No.
Clifford?
Abstain.
Dombrowski?
Aye.
Farrow?
Voting, believing that it's still going to get overturned because of the cities. I agree with the access and the idea behind it, so yes, I'll say yes.
Heidelbeck Terremoto? Aye. Harada?
Aye.
Huffman? Lynch? Nevedal? Peck? Ron?
Nay.
Stevenson?
Aye.
Sweeney?
Emphatically aye.
Williams? Nay. Woolsey?
Nay.
Wu?
Aye.
You? Aye. Motion passes.
All right. So the fun's going to continue. We've got one other item. Number 7, discussion and possible action on Section 5500, Bureau of Cannabis Control's proposed regulations pertaining to micro business. Mr. Sweeney, did you just leave your mic on, or you want to start off the discussion? No? All right. All right, so this had come up in past discussions. I know we've got a lot of speakers here that have been talking about micro business and that distinction between micro and home and so forth. And right now we're happy to start that conversation. This was at the direction of you all down in San Diego that we bring this back as an item. So who would like to jump in first on micro business?
I'm a little concerned about kind of rehashing a lot of older conversation, but I do think one of the things that's really important is that the pathway for small businesses and especially existing cultivators, existing businesses, family businesses, I really truly believe that this micro business was a carve out to help make that pathway easier for those entities that have been and hopefully will continue to be able to provide medicine to patients and also to adult use consumers. The micro business, I mean, we made recommendations via the micro business subcommittee to actually bring this back to a program that would benefit the small business. That recommendation passed the CAC, and we still haven't seen any results in that. I do find this a really challenging conversation. I believe we also requested some clarification about whether or not micro businesses were, like this license was originally intended for the small cultivator to be able to conduct value-added activities as part of that small cultivation, and that's a really crucial component to many of these mom-and-pop operations that have long been the main providers for the patients and the residents of California. And so I just have pretty severe, extreme concerns that as a whole we've missed the mark of the intention of the micro business as it's been regulated currently. So I'll leave it at that.
All right. Anyone else? Really? That's like the first time you guys haven't had anything to say. Well, all right. You know, I think the, you know, and feel free to come forward because I think we're moving on to public comment here pretty quickly. You know, we don't have a specific action, you know, under this one like we did with the last. However, you know, we've heard, I think, quite a lot of discussion in recent meetings related to microbusiness and the concept that it didn't quite meet the expectations of, I think, the small business owners. You know, how do we make our way through that, and what our recommendation would be here? It's kind of challenging because, you know, we have microbusiness and then we have home business, right? And that's really kind of what some folks are starting to drill down to is, you know, how small do we go, and does microbusiness meet the expectations of the small business owners, and especially those that are represented here at the table? You know, what we've heard at multiple meetings is no, we haven't quite met those expectations at all. And so how do we either modify these regulations or create new ones to meet that expectation? Because certainly, you know, I think we've seen that as the regulations are unfolding and as we interpret the law as it was passed, you know, that interpretation isn't always doesn't always come to where we thought it would be, and you know, again, you know, you got to recognize, and I think we all do, is that the law is, you know, is only this big. The regulations are this big, and then you add on the court cases, and it's this big, right? And it creates this hugely challenging environment to operate in, and oftentimes we're given, you know, an intent and some vague language, and then, you know, the challenge is for the Bureau and others to actually implement that intent, and a lot of people can read the same sentence, you know, several different ways. And it's a challenge for us, and so hopefully we can, at least by the end of this discussion, this agenda item, have a recommendation that helps alleviate some of those concerns we've heard. I see Dr. Cermak's here, and then Mr. Clifford right after.
Does the microbusiness subcommittee have suggestions how to hit that mark?
Well, as a member of that committee, I'm not sure we do. I just want to echo what the chairman said a minute ago. I think this is caused by an imprecise statute. It looks to me, I have something of a passing interest in this subject. I'm not an expert, but it looks to me like we had a statute whose intent originally was to make this something that applied to small cultivators, 10,000 square feet or less. And then, you know, subsequently, when the agency took a look at that, you look at the exact language of the statute, it doesn't precisely say that, right? So we got this interpretation. We have rules that just pick 3 out of 4 of the activities and you can be a micro business. Fine. But there's nothing left in there that I can see that limits this to small businesses other than the word micro, or the prefix micro in the title, right? So to me, our charge is to figure out some kind of recommendation for how to fill that in. And for me, I mean, I would default personally back to what looks like the original intent of the statute was to tie it to small cultivators, 10,000 square feet or less of cultivation as a starting point. I know that that's somewhat controversial. A lot of people don't like that, but it's what we have in statute, so I would propose that.
And I would agree with you, Mr. Clifford. I also think that this has been interpreted not so much to create a micro-business pathway, but to be a catch-all for vertical integration and allow discounts for people who want to be vertically integrated. And I just don't think that was the original intention of the authors of Proposition 64.
So I move that we advise the BCC to relook at the regulations in order to better serve what we believe to be the original function of serving the small farmers and providing them access to the market.
I'll second that.
Could we get clarification on what exactly the motion means or entails?
Yeah, because yeah, please.
Did I hit the right one?
You did, yeah.
I'm on? Okay. The purpose of the motion is to provide, hopefully, our consensus as an advisory committee that the regulations need to be reworked in order to favor the small farmer, since we see that as the original intention of Prop 64.
Is that inclusive of home businesses?
That would be for us to decide, because I don't know the answer to that.
I think one of the challenges that where we get into this conversation with home businesses is after the last release of the second round of emergency regulations, conducting a micro-business activities in conjunction with a residence was prohibited. So it kind of put another layer of whammy on people who had been conducting activities in the manner of, like, say along the lines of a cottage industry or a cottage business. And so I think that that poses additional challenges to the micro business. So if you can't, I mean, if you can use your kitchen at your home to bake bread as cottage industry, or to make brownies, or to provide granola, or to do any of the number of things that happen in cottage industry, I think this is where we're probably kind of leaping out of the micro business and into the home business conversation, because, as I mentioned, the latest round of emergency regulations stripped that opportunity away. And this is how most of these entities had already been structured, right? They were doing infusions and salves and tinctures in their home kitchen along the lines of a cottage business.
So are we saying the micro business license would allow for home businesses?
I don't think that's not necessarily what I got from the motion. I think the home business component has to do a lot with this restriction of licensed activities within the residence. I think that's where the conversation kind of stepped away from the micro business and into the ability to operate as a home business.
Yeah, because with the micro, if we remember when MCRSA came out, there was no vertical integration, so you had to pick and choose which side you were on. So then you had a lot of small growers that would have gotten crushed in the process. So the microbusiness was sort of set up to assist and help and support the small grower and to find their way into the marketplace. Along the way, at some point, what ended up happening was there was really no difference between the big business guy getting a microbusiness license and the smaller farmer getting a microbusiness license. For all intents and purposes, with the restriction on 10,000 square feet of grow, you're the same manufacturer, the same distributor. And because through the governor's trailer bill, we did away with the restriction on vertical integration, so you can be vertically integrated. In fact, now you're actually at a disadvantage if you're a micro business license, because now all your licenses, at least 3 of them, are tied together. And when you do good in business and you expand your operations, you really don't have that convenience of being able to separate them out or really expand. Now what started off as a license and a tier to help and support actually ends up becoming a negative. So I think we got to look at it from 2 sides. If the spirit of it was to assist and support the small grower, we got to look at the micro business license and identify what incentives and what support is there for the small grower that doesn't exist for the bigger operator that happens to hold a micro business license. And then the second part of it is, and we had a discussion on this previously, what happens when you do good in business with a micro business license? You're a small farmer, you grow, now you're at a point where you can really expand and scale. How do you do that without being penalized for being successful with your micro business license? So if there's some sort of a mechanism to be able to allow for the assistance and the expansion of a micro business license, or not even there at the beginning, allow for the smaller farmer an opportunity, an incentive that doesn't exist for the bigger guy, for the bigger business guy that just happens to have a micro license.
And then just to speak to the expansion, so as a micro business licensee, potentially, right, having 10,000 square feet of cultivation, if I am in a position where my product line is, I can't keep up with it because I'm trying to produce it at my home and I'm cultivating all my own cannabis, and the only way to do that would be to expand operations. That's a business plan that needs to be put together, where I have to look at whether or not it makes sense for me as a micro business license holder to, say, set up a manufacturing facility, to be able to take in more cannabis plant material, to be able to broaden my product line. So I don't know that that the micro-business license itself should necessarily consider this inevitable or expansive and infinite growth opportunity. I think it really is this how do we allow for these small cultivators to have value-added opportunities? And if they do really, really well, which I hope they do, right, then they should be able to work with those resources to expand their businesses, acquire other licensure, look for investment, and take the next step, right, away from a home business. This happens in all sorts of commodities, right? One of the leading bread companies up in Humboldt, where I am, they started as a cottage business. That's what they started at. They were baking bread in their home. They now have cafes, they have a bakery area, and they are delivering all over the Tri-County region. That was a business decision they made to go from their little home bakery, right, their cottage industry, into a full-fledged, daily delivered fresh bread to the marketplace.
No, those are all perfect points. So the bigger differentiator would really be the cultivation, because on the manufacturing side, it is what it is. Distribution is a natural given. With the cultivation, and going back to the spirit of it, if it was to assist the small grower, and that's why it was 10,000 square feet, and understanding that if you have a micro business license, you don't necessarily need to have that cultivation tier. It's really 3 of the 4 categories. So why not try to identify ways to support additionally the company, the person, the group that does get a micro business license that's in line with the initial spirit of it, where they are a small farmer, they are a small grower, and they're looking for the opportunity. It allows them the vertical integration, but it does allow them to be able to expand out from there. Because if you get a micro business license for purposes of non-cultivation, none of this stuff really even applies to you anyway. So, and it's taken away from the people that it was intended for. So I think if we look into, because we're having discussions and not really understanding, okay, what the discussion is around, and we got to, I think, jump into the cultivation aspect of this.
I don't think the statute would allow for the expansion of cultivation, right, because the 10,000 square feet is definitely within the statute.
No, I'm talking about before, because if you're at a point where you're expanding, the statute doesn't really matter. You're probably in a position to get more licenses and expand out and all that stuff. So I think the start of the journey is a lot more important than when you get to the point of being successful. And it's how do we support and help and create an environment that's more supportive for the small grower to be able to at least level the playing field and kind of bring this back in line with the spirit of it.
Those are huge questions. And I appreciate them tremendously. I don't know that I have more statements, but I'm sure the public has some good insights on that potentially.
Oh yeah, that was the kind of.
Excellent.
All right, so we have a motion, motion and a second. Did we get a second? Yes. We did, Cliff? Okay, perfect. So we have a motion and a second. Any other comments? We'll move on to public comment then.
What was the motion?
Dr. Cermak, one more time, sir.
Son. Thank you. The motion was to advise the BCC to rework the regulations around microbusiness in order to favor the small grower in a way that was originally intended in Prop 64.
All right, well stated. Thank you. Let's go ahead and open the public comment, please.
If you have would like to comment on this item, please line up, and we'll start with speaker number 1, please.
Chair Rahm, you said that we have the micro business and we have the home business. We don't have the home business yet. What we're proposing is the micro business is already sailed. The licenses have been issued. What we're proposing is an alternative to get back to where we believe the micro business was supposed to be. Something, and we've given you documentation for that. We would love to give you a presentation with more than a minute and a half. In order to help the restrictions, what the Bureau has done, though, is help to solve one of the issues that you have. What happens after you reach that limit? Well, you can go to a micro business, and you can grow from there because it's unlimited for manufacturing and retail and distribution. You can source material as a manufacturer for your manufacturing business. You can buy 20 tons if you want. So the cultivation is not an issue. With this home business that we're proposing, which would be a new license, which you have the authority to do, then we would be able to keep people that don't want to be Walmart. They just want to be the mom and pop corner store so that they can subsist, supplement their income so they can put food on the table and pay their bills. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
Good afternoon, Susan Tibbin. California is a very large and diverse state. One size does not fit all, doesn't even fit most. Entry-level fees have already been doubled. The fees are an extreme barrier to entry. The security measures suitable for corporate entities are an extreme barrier to entry for the small operator. The Bureau has determined that manufacturing, distribution, and retail are unlimited activities for microbusiness. There is nothing micro about this license. The Bureau seems to have misinterpreted the intent. The newly legalized industry is built on the backs of decades of work and risk and knowledge of legacy farmers. The Bureau needs to exercise compassion and smart long-term fiscal incentives. There's a real need for a new license for the small home-based operator with vertical integration with caps. A new home business license tied to gross receipts guarantees increased adoption, a stable tax base in areas with few retraining options, and promotion of health and safety via diminution of under-the-table markets and the use of already in place home business inspections via local municipalities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Speaker number 3.
Hannah Nelson. Microbusiness is one of those topics, as with a number of other topics, that where on the one hand it is a not one size fits all problem, and at the same time we have to be mindful of the need for consistency across the board, and that is the ultimate challenge for regulators in any situation. I think that the biggest challenges that face small cultivators, that's the predominant constituency that I work with, are a couple of things. Number one, the locations, and especially rural locations, it's extremely difficult to find property that will be okayed by the local land use rules for particular activities. So for example, manufacturing may not be able to be done in your home kitchen, or it may not be able to be done even on your overall property, but has to be in a commercial area or industrial area, et cetera. So I think that looking at the premises on which activities can take place, allowing for multiple locations in some cases, especially with the encouragement of shared facilities, such as the manufacturing S license that's been developed, as well as potentially other shared processing or microprocessing licenses that might be promoted, is one thing to look at. The
Thank
other
you.
thing, oh, thanks.
Speaker number 1.
Hi. Unlike Proposition 19 in 2010, the Emerald Triangle voted in favor of Proposition 64, and many for human rights reasons, but also I think the microbusiness license was a big reason they did, because I had a lot of conversations with people around that, and we thought that it was going to level the playing field. I've become fond of saying I didn't work for legalization for 25 years to legalize it only for 5 venture capitalists out of Canada, while everyone else stays illegal. And more, that's what it's looking like. I was happy when I heard Lori Ajax was appointed, because I understood that she came from the craft beer side of things. And it seemed to me with the micro business license that what we were doing was taking care of that right at the outset, instead of making the mistakes that the liquor industry had made in the beginning. You know, this is California. We're for cottage farmers. We're for small businesses and our food supply. And I thought it was all going to happen around that. I had a Napa Valley kind of vision for, you know, Humboldt County and the places. And I'll tell you, I've lived in Humboldt County, and the place that reminded me the most of is when I used to go to Appalachia with my church work group when I was a kid. It's the only other place I've ever seen outhouses. And cannabis has been propping up the rural economy of a lot of places in California, not just the Emerald Triangle. It's all going to look like Appalachia. The microbusiness subcommittee had several specific recommendations that we need to look at. I wish I had time to talk about them. Thanks.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
The microbusiness license type, really, I want to echo what Ellen just said and several others. What a beautiful fit for California in general, and Northern California, especially the rural counties specifically. The spirit of it is a wonderful, wonderful fit, and could help become the California brand someday. And using it as a means to bring pre-existing operators into compliance, what a wonderful tool. But here we are today with, give or take, 100 microbusiness licensees statewide, not one in Humboldt, Mendo, or Trinity, where I'm from, not one. And so this does need some work. It needs to get massaged to be a better fit. And I think starting with having mandatory 10,000 square foot or less of cultivation helps make it a better fit. I think putting a cap on it at some level to stop calling it micro and then call it some other vertically integrated animal might be useful. And there's an essential component to this, that the rural counties be allowed to run with their own local conditions for at least a short period of time to once again help get this supply chain moving right now. So I encourage the ability for local counties to have their own security and premises requirements.
Thank you. Speaker number 3.
You know, it's been stated several times by this committee and by the public that the cannabis industry is not new. It's newly legalized and regulated. It has legally been around since 1996 and has been around for many years before that. With the passage of McCursa, the Bureau was established to create a comprehensive and coherent regulatory framework for an established industry that had not been comprehensively regulated by the state. While the industry will obviously grow and change, there needs to be regulations to control this. The framework should also be for the established industry, as stated, not the other way around, establishing an entirely new industry with the framework. The industry's operations until recently have almost always been performed by a home business. This would be an extension or a variation of a micro business. I would love to be able to talk for more than a minute and a half and give a presentation for what we're proposing for a home business. The premises that one of the speakers was talking about can be solved very easy with an accessory license for another permit, where, say, a jurisdiction would not allow manufacturing on agricultural land. It has to be industrial. They would be able to get an accessory license, would be an adjunct to the primary license, so you would still have as the statute states, one license, but it would be an accessory license for an additional location.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
Ross Gordon. I'm a policy program coordinator with California Growers Association. We represent, many small farmers. This is definitely a frustrating issue for many of our members. The fact that, there have been about 100 microbusiness licenses issued, and almost all of those are in urban areas. Nothing against urban areas, but this is a license that I think the key word is accessibility. It needs to at least be accessible to small farmers who are operating in rural areas. And for that to happen, a couple major things need to change. So I'm really glad that this motion is on the table. Want to echo one particular thing which was said earlier. The committee actually considered at their Oakland meeting in May a recommendation that would have said that local governments can exempt from certain state security requirements, things like video surveillance and alarm systems, which are currently prescribed at the state level. And you all voted on that, and the vote was 8-6 in favor of local governments should be able to provide that exemption. However, there were 10 abstentions. And my understanding, based on going back to that meeting, is that the reason that there were 10 abstentions is that there was a sense of a lack of clarity about what the microbusiness license was or what it was intended to be. I hope now that I feel like there's been some time and maybe you'll have more clarity, it may be a good time to revisit that recommendation and see if it would be possible to get a majority of people here to support that. Thanks.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
Yes, I'm Tim Bluck. I'm the founder of the Emerald Cup. We've been going 15 years now, the largest cannabis competition, organic outdoor in the country, in the world for that matter. But I'm actually one of those people that is going to be a larger player in the industry. We're getting manufacturing licenses, and we have a number of vertical integration companies. But as the Emerald Cup's always represented small craft farmers and small craft product makers, I've watched people like Paul and Susan and the Sweet Leaf people and the Weed for Warriors do service work like you guys are. You're not being paid. Most of them don't, and they've been representing this industry for the last 20 or more years. I was born and raised in this industry basically since I was 14 years old, so I've watched it all. And it's really important that people like Paul and Susan and the people that really built this industry get a chance. And that's what 64 was supposed to be about. That's why I voted for it. And I've taken a lot of flack from a lot of people for voting for it because of what it's done to the small craft farmers and the cultivators. And it's like Ellen's saying, we all know it. The Canadians have come in, they've gone right around us, they're taking over the world. And while we're trying to fight to get out of a paper bag here, we're watching a whole industry go by us. So like you said, I'm going to be fine myself, and my companies are going to be good. But for people like Sweet Leaf and the Weed for Warriors, and for all the wonderful people like Paul and Susan that have done so much for this industry, we really should help them with the micro business and the home manufacturing. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 3.
Hannah Nelson again. I have some specific recommendations. If we have a distinction between self-distribution versus distribution for others, or vertical integration for that business versus taking in on behalf of others, that could help delineate the types of advantages that one might want to afford small micro businesses. Also, if we tier micro business licenses, particularly with the fees and the categories, I think that could address a lot of the issues with respect to access and decisions on who should benefit. Allowed shared facilities as a qualifying use activity, and allow multiple locations to qualify, but again, tied to income caps, because unless you tie it to income caps, then all kinds of larger organizations might try to take advantage of it. Also, perhaps cap gross income to remain eligible in the microbusiness category. Finally, remove insurance requirements for self-distribution. And this is not just in the context of micro-business, but also on distributor transport-only licenses, or even in distributor licenses that are just for self-distribution. It's ridiculous that people should have to insure for $2 million their own product that they're trying to get to market. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
Thank you, Susan Tibbin. Thank you for bringing up this really vital issue. And in order to shed more light on what might work, in an effort to further the intent of the statute, reduce diversion, and in recognition of the foregoing discussion, the Bureau has the authority to adopt a new license that encourages the contributions of the small operator and/or the legacy farmer as a home business license. While the home business license holder would realize substantial reductions in current taxes, regulations, and fees, the contributions of these licenses are expected to enhance fiscal expectations to the state by increased adoption, more legitimate licenses, competition, more choices for the consumer, less onerous regulations due to the scale of the operation, and a sense of community for other small farmers, ensuring a smoother transition to the regulated marketplace. In terms of security, the Bureau shall authorize the local jurisdiction to use its discretion and be responsible for the review and approval of the home business license applicant's security plan. The plan shall be site-specific based on circumstances and conditions pertaining to the premises for the activities of the licensee. The improved security plan shall not create an undue burden or hardship to the licensee, and the security plan shall include language pertaining to the treatment of cannabis waste and destruction. Thank you.
Speaker number 3.
What we're proposing with this home business license is that the limitation be on the volume of cannabis. The 10,000 square feet would be of canopy. This would be the limit. A lot of the smaller farmers would stick to the 2,500 square feet of canopy, but once they got past that 10,000 square foot limit, then they couldn't cultivate anymore. And Susan was talking about the sense of community. They would also be able to work with other small cultivators who don't want to have the full responsibilities of distribution and or manufacturing, but they would be able to act as them, as with a sense of community, so that they wouldn't be charged the 35% distribution fees that the distributors would have. They would be able to go down and take them for gas money in some cases, I'm sure. There is a tight community where the way that we operate. So they would also be able to do up to 10,000 square feet of cultivation, say 2,500 square feet, 5,000, what have you. They would also be able to up to 20 pounds of rejected things for remediation, but not for pesticides, but for mold or mildews and things like that, natural pathogens that they could remediate. So what we're trying to do is get the sense of community that we have back and live our lives the way that we need to. Thank you.
Speaker 2.
Yep. Once again, John Brower from Trinity County, and in Trinity, we just passed a local ordinance pertaining to microbusiness, making it an available permit type, and we included a provision that where the supervisors or their designee would have to approve a security and operations plan. A designee would likely be our county sheriff, and I think there's a bit of a misnomer when we talk about home businesses, microbusiness. The way we wrote our microbusiness ordinance is where you would have to have a separate premises for each license type on one property or a series of adjoining properties. So it's not like people are going to be running 4 different complicated regulation-intensive license types all off of their kitchen table. They have to have a separate permitted premises for each that would be the home for that license type. And so I think we could use words like homestead scale or something like that and help avoid the confusion of people trying to run all this off their kitchen table. And we're further along than that. And I encourage you to take a very serious look at this. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
Regarding the private residence for this home operation, and the prohibition that was put in on May 18th after their last meeting. The local jurisdiction in Mendocino County has been working with this microbusiness, assuming that it was for the small farmer, and tailoring it towards their ordinance on home occupations and cottage industries, of which there are 3 tiers currently on their books, and they're dovetailing it into that. The prohibition on residences shot that down. They also were working, because it is so prevalent in Mendocino County, that people were have been doing these things for a long time. They brought in consultants and have been working for months and months trying to get overlays in their zonings for separate areas where it's known that there's residential plots that don't meet the requirements that are residential, and they have an opt-in and opt-out to accommodate these people. So this, in order for them to do what they're doing, to get the value-added products, they have to work out of their home. There's been a lot of work on this local level to do that, and this provision for the private residents is just shooting that right down and taking communities with it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to shut down the public comment period because the round robin thing is, you know, not exactly. So here's the thing is, you know, we'll get to your other issues in just a moment, because I think the piece we're missing here is, first, we've got an item on the table here for a vote. But I think I've got another motion I'd like to make here that might help alleviate some of the concerns. So again, we've heard from the public. We've got a motion on the table in a second. Any more discussion?
Since it's been a while, can we have the motion reread to the groups so we know what we're voting on?
Oh, I think we've got to.
The motion is to advise the Bureau to rework the regulations around micro business in order to favor small farmers, which was the original intent of 64.
All right, can we get a vote, please?
Baboulian.
I'm actually kind of confused. I'll abstain from this one, but yeah.
Cermak.
Yes.
Clifford. Dombrowski. Aye. Farrow.
Aye.
Heidelbach Teramoto.
Aye.
Harada. Aye. Nevedal. Aye. Ron.
Aye.
Stevenson.
Aye.
Sweeney.
Aye.
Williams.
Aye.
Woolsey.
Aye.
Wu. You.
Aye.
Motion passes, and also for the record, 3 members had left, members Peck, Huffman, and Lynch, but quorum maintains.
Okay, so Mr. Baboulian, did you want to follow up with a comment? I know you're.
No, I was just confused about it, whether or not the motion was to rework the regulations, or if it was to rework them. I've stayed past it. We're good.
Sure, got it. So here's what I'd propose too, because this is a challenging forum to have, more of a workshop and discussion environment, and I think there's a lot that needs to happen as far as this discussion goes, not just from the micro business, but again, talking about that cottage industry or home business or whatever, however we want to characterize that. And I don't think this is, like I say, a challenging venue to try and have that conversation, and we're not. How do I say this? It's not exactly like we're taking folks out of the audience and bringing them up to provide presentations like we've had from other expert testimony and others, right? And that's sort of I think a little bit of a challenge for us to say, okay, now we'd like to have a presentation from, Susan or Paul or somebody else, and say, come on up and give us 20 minutes of your time, because, it creates a distinct, I think, sort of treatment of the public in a slightly different way, because then everybody's going to expect that they get, at some point, if they lobby us hard enough or, send me enough emails, that everybody's going to get a 20-minute or so presentation. And I think that's not kind of the intent. The whole point, I think, of us creating those subcommittees in the first place was to deal with these issues on a little bit better scale. And of course, the subcommittee itself did, I think, a yeoman's job of trying to address this, certainly. And it's not an easy issue. And the recommendations, I think, were good. And unfortunately, you know, the comment by the Bureau was, you know, not addressed in the current emergency or proposed regulations. And that's a simple response because, yeah, it's just simply not in the current or proposed, you know what I mean? So they're not going to, you know, so it's, you know, they're not going to rewrite regulations or place something in just based on our recommendation. And so while I appreciate the motion, Dr. Cermak, of, you know, sort of kicking it back to the agency, I also think it's incumbent on us as an organization, or as a committee rather, to be responsive to those requests. And so my motion would be very simple: is could we, you know, ask that the subcommittee on microbusiness reconvene at some point in the future soon to host more of a workshop style discussion of these issues, including, you know, a longer discussion on the home business and all of that we've heard today, because again, this isn't necessarily the forum to do that, and it's more of a you know, I think a specific conversation for those who have a deeper interest and obviously intelligence on it. And so, you know, rather than us try and struggle through here at the dais trying to figure out how to deal with this, I would much rather see this kicked back down and addressed there and report back to our group at a later date. That way, hopefully, it provides a little bit easier forum to have more of a relaxed conversation on this, and allow us to, you know, tackle these issues a little bit more evenly.
Was that an official motion?
Yes, it was.
I will second your motion.
And I would also, if you don't mind reseconding, I'd like to make sure that we extend specific invitations to the folks who have been here, and we've got, I'm sure, their contact information because you've been at every meeting, and so, you know, extend specific invitations to those, and make sure that the materials are provided to the committee, because I know you've emailed me, you know, specific information over time, but I'm not confident that that's gotten out to all the members. But make sure that all of that information gets out to that subcommittee as well.
I accept your friendly amendment.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other discussion on that?
Just a dumb question. Do we need a motion for the subcommittee to meet again, or is it,
Yes.
we don't, but it's a good idea, or we do? Okay.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, because they're technically, you know, we never voted on whether or not we would bring back the subcommittees, and I think at the time, our sense was, for some of those, like public safety and others, you know, there was no need to keep a standing, you know, subcommittee on all these topics. And we had some question about whether, you know, this original motion that I had asked for several meetings ago, and we never really continued that discussion because we never saw the value in it. But I think we all understand that there was value depending on when these topics come up. I don't think it's, you know, not a bad idea for us to keep in mind the subcommittees that we represented, and you know, as needed, you know, come back to those to help address some of these more challenging questions. So anyway, so that's a motion, a second. Dr. Cermak?
Well, at the risk of volunteering someone else to do work, we are going to Eureka next, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
And that seems to be the most logical place for public comment. So if there's any way that you'd be willing to do that in conjunction with our meeting, like the day before, half a day before, that seems like it would be ideal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if that's the will of the subcommittee, we'll leave it up to you folks to figure that out. Yeah.
We won't take that to a vote. That's a great idea.
What's that?
Right. May I ask a question of the chair of the subcommittee? As we're putting together the reports, each of the subcommittee chairs are putting together the reports to have available at the September meeting. I think one of the places where we got really challenged, because I served on that committee with you, thank you for chairing it, was we bumped up against a lot of statutory issues. We had a number of recommendations, and I think around 80% of them got thrown into the statutory pile. And so I think that I would like us to be mindful of making sure that those recommendations and those conversations can get into the report, because I think it's really kind of one of the big hiccups we're bumping into with the micro business.
And I think, just talking with staff here, I think the challenge is going to be on meeting space and finding, location, all that. I know they've had to arrange all of this well ahead of time. So trying to do something the day before, maybe we can come back with a full, after the subcommittee sort of, gets reestablished here. But my recommendation will also be that maybe that's the first part of that meeting that day, is that it's just focused on that subcommittee, that discussion. Give ample time for that, but be able to come back, with the full committee later that day, say after lunch or something like that. Because when we ran this before, we had the subcommittees, sort of phase, before and after lunch, different subcommittees meeting when we've done this. So maybe that's the best approach, is, the pre-lunch is the subcommittee talking about microbusiness and these other issues, and then we come back to the full committee later that day.
Chairman, we're not on number 10 future agenda items, are we?
Not yet.
Okay.
No.
Yep.
One thing I would say is that our subcommittees were small by necessity, not by interest. We had to tackle several issues in a very crammed, short period of time. I think it would be wise for us to consider allowing some additional people to participate on those committees if you would be so willing. Because I had interest in multiple that I couldn't be in.
I mean, we could always reform. What are the rules on subcommittee size? Okay, so we do have the ability to sort of reestablish that subcommittee there. So, I guess we can just sort of go through, and by show of hands, who was originally on the committee, who's able to serve at the next meeting, just out of curiosity. Get them up there. All right, but you're not going to be here, Mr. Sweeney. So we've got Nevedal, we've got Clifford, and Heidelbach Teramoto. All right, and additional members being Mr. Farrow, Mr. Baboulian, and that's it. All right, so that would be the amended motion, is to have that subcommittee of those 5 members.
I will accept that. Thank you.
Okay. Any other discussion? Seeing none, we have one public comment. Let's go ahead and do that.
I would certainly hope that the discussion around microbusiness would also include, since the ship has already sailed for microbusiness, that it would also include the introduction of a new license, which would be called the home business license.
All right, thank you. All right, I think we've got our marching orders. Let's go ahead and take a vote.
Baboulian.
Aye.
Cermak.
Aye.
Clifford.
Aye.
Dombrowski.
Aye.
Farrow.
Aye.
Heidelbach Teramoto.
Aye.
Harada. Nevedal. Ron.
Aye.
Stevenson.
Aye.
Sweeney. Williams.
Aye.
Woolsey.
Aye.
Wu. You.
Aye.
Motion passes.
All right, fantastic. All right, moving on. We are on item number 8, discussion and possible action. Oh, no, sorry, number 9. Nope, let's go to that one. Let's go to future agenda items. Go ahead and tackle that one real quick. We're going to skip ahead to number 10. Future agenda items. Ms. Nevedal.
We had talked multiple times about having events be one of the future agenda items, so I just wanted to bring that back up and see if we could add that to the list or make sure it's still on there.
I'd like to suggest adding delivery 5814 A and C on it.
50. I'm sorry, say that again. 58.
5814 A and C, that's the limit on how much delivery can go out with, and that's also on basically dynamic delivery, being that takes care of a lot of the local concerns.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Cermak.
I would like to revisit the issue of advertising health claims for non-medical cannabis, since that's illegal, and yet we're now in a position where A&M are essentially the same until someone decides to take it out of the inventory and label one for this display case and the other for the other display case. I think we've created a situation that could really end up confusing people in terms of what they can say, what they can't say, what's advertising, what's not advertising.
Okay. Any others? All right, I don't need a motion since I get the distinct pleasure of setting our agendas. I'm also cognizant of our past agenda items, including tribal and other issues that were discussed. So we're trying to pair these up as appropriately based on location, but also based on, frankly, just the time we have to deal with this and priorities as far as the regulations roll out. And so that's kind of how we've been responsive so far. And so we're just kind of playing a little bit of triage on this. So I'll be working very closely with staff to make sure we continue that process and make the agenda items as timely as possible. Okay, and so we will go ahead and take public comment on agenda items.
Thank you. Jackie McGowan, K Street Consulting, on behalf of several clients. 2 items that we would like to see on the next agenda is track and trace failure. Specifically, BCC Regulation Section 5050D states that when a licensed business loses access to California's online regulatory tracking software, they may not conduct business with any other cannabis businesses or with consumers until their access is restored. While the language was intended to affect individual businesses who lose access, the ambiguity could have unintended consequences that could shut down the entire marketplace should the state's chosen track and trace company metric end up failing themselves. That's item number 1. Item number 2 is phase 3 testing. Currently, there are 33 licensed laboratories in the state of California. I can only confirm that 17 and a half of them are conducting phase 2 testing. And I say a half because 1 lab is only conducting phase 2 for flower, not for manufactured products. So out of those 17 and a half licensed labs that are currently conducting phase 2, not one of them is currently taking on R&D for phase 3. Some say they'll be ready within a few weeks, but it's yet to be seen. So that needs to be an item. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 2.
Hello, my name is Preston. I'm a just patient and advocate, I guess. What I've noticed in this whole process is, we all can agree on the health benefits of the plant, and what I've come in my studies to learn is that the baby version of a plant, the microgreen of the plant, is probably one of the healthiest ways, whether it be any plant, basil. But I can't legally grow microgreened cannabis to make a salad because I could go to jail for having 300 little plants. And I think that there's just a little bit of gray area in there that could maybe be brought up in a conversation about, growing more than 6 plants to a certain height so that we can eat it as food like it is and have that be okay. So maybe, in a future meeting to change the 6 plant minimum or maximum to something greater if it's not going to be grown to full scale. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 3.
Hannah Nelson again. I would request that you take up the issue of cooperative associations. There are a number of problems. I think that as with microbusiness, it was intended to be a benefit to help smaller operators come together and have an economy of scale to a certain extent, and there are some serious failings with the actual implementation and rollout of it. One little example is that and this is a statutory thing, I recognize, but it requires that the articles of incorporation state that it's a cannabis business, which would immediately prevent somebody from getting a bank account. So at any rate, I would encourage you to take up that issue, as well as the extension of temporary licenses past January 1st. I am gravely concerned about outside resource agencies being woefully behind in their processing of CDFA, lake and stream bed alteration agreements, or water quality protection permits and other issues. And the backlog is huge. And while we say, oh, we're only in August, we still have a while go, I have have clients who have literally waited a year and a half for their LSAs. So I'm a little bit concerned of the sunsetting of the temporary licenses, and I would love a discussion of what the plan is for people who have provided all the information that they need for their annual permit licenses, but are unable to proceed forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker number 1.
Hello, it's Jim Louie with the Emerald Cup, and would like to second Ms. Nevedal's request for a meeting or an agenda item on events. As you guys know, we've been at every meeting and have made this request each and every time. So please, please, please add events to the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 2.
Hi, I would like to have a discussion about, I've heard it called composite testing. The small farmer may only have 50 pounds in his entire harvest, but may have 4 different strains. Having the harvest all together as one 50-pound batch and for compliance testing, and then cannabinoid profiles for the remaining 3 strains would drastically reduce the costs for the small farmer. It would make sense. It's all grown in the same manner, harvested at the same time. But to charge $1,200 4 times as opposed to $1,200 and then 3 for cannabinoid profiles, so that they have, I mean, it makes sense. It would save money, and the small farmer needs every break he can get. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 3.
Very much agree with what Paul was just talking about. Compositing is the #1 regulatory concern for our members right now. The ability to take multiple different strains that are smaller batches and composite them into a single batch for testing. We recently surveyed all of our members for this round of regulations, and that was considered to be the highest priority regulatory change. More broadly, I think testing in general would be a great thing for the committee to take a sort of broader look at. I think a lot of people would agree that it's a huge bottleneck in the supply chain. Every single product has to go through testing. It has the capacity to really impact whether or not the regulated market is competitive with the illicit market. It's the single biggest regulatory cost according to the state's analysis by a pretty large range. And compositing is just one of several different policies that could be addressed with testing. Another very large concern with testing that folks are having is concerns about reliability and variability. Getting different results from different testing labs can be a big problem. And there's just a lot that needs to be worked out. And I think, especially by the time we roll around to the next meeting, I think a lot of these testing issues will be coming to a head even more. So it would be a great time to agendize it.
Thank you. Speaker 1.
Hi, my name is Sabino Seguera with Digama Consulting. I'm here to talk about Section 5705A and the general sampling requirements that, from what I've been told, basically disallows the subletting of sample testing from one laboratory to another qualified laboratory. And this is very unusual. It doesn't really occur in other laboratory testing industries for food or for environmental. And now this, it may seem minor, but this causes an increase in the final cost of testing. It discourages proper investigation into anomalous results, and it increases the differences between labs. If labs can't freely sublet to one another, they can't investigate any kind of data that may look anomalous, and will basically push the lab to either put out a result that they don't feel completely confident with, or have to go back and resample the entire lot from the client, which adds time and cost to both the laboratory, the client, and then eventually to the end user. And I think that by striking this clause, we can get around this, because we'll start to see when there are recalls and differences in results, that if laboratories haven't been able to do this before they put the result out, there won't really be a problem. But if laboratories push a result onto metric and then have to go back later on and change it, it's a big problem, and that causes an investigation and impossible recall. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 2.
Hi, so at Cal Normal, among the regulatory problems that consumers are finding vexing right now are the confoundedly hard to open, non-recyclable packaging required for every purchase, and the exit bags, which people are, as we have heard, throwing away, and I found mine impossible to open. The exorbitantly expensive testing requirements, far beyond what is needed to protect consumer health and far more stringent than what is required for other agricultural food products like tomatoes and apples that are consumed in far higher quantities. And finally, being hounded for IDs and driver's license every time you enter and step into a dispensary. They should be more like drugstores or bars. I think this is one reason the program hasn't been as successful as we all hoped it would be so far. People are concerned about their privacy. They're concerned about federal laws and gun laws. There's nothing in the statute, although track and trace is required, it's only the licensees that are required to be tracked by my reading of the statute. And also, although someone is only allowed to possess 1 ounce at a time, the daily limits that someone can only buy 1 ounce at any dispensary is in regulations, not in law. And that's one reason why people are tracking people, scanning their IDs when they walk in, and I think it's turning people away and it's turning them back to the black market. Thanks.
Thank you. Speaker 3.
Rich Miller, this is not really on the regulations, it's more on a state of what's going out there in the industry. I do work at a therapeutic alternative, and we do not have a problem getting our product. But over the last 2 months, I have gone through all the dispensaries in Sacramento, and to my surprise, those shelves are empty. Even the therapeutic alternative, we are well connected. We have access to that medicine because we search it out. A lot of these companies don't have that ability to do the groundwork or get up and running. We need to do something to implement that. I bring that forth for most important purposes because we have to have access to the patients. But the one thing that I am seeing that we are having a shortfall is our CBD medicine. And to me, that really worries me for these patients out there that are relying on certain cannabinoid profiles and ratios, and we're not able to get those. The Rick Simpson oil protocol, we're not able to get that high CBD oil and the high THC, or a combination of different ratios, because companies like Chronic Essential, which were very valuable to getting medicine out to those patients, can no longer exist because their localities do not have the ability to move forward or do not want to move forward, regardless of what the constituents are saying. I think we need to address this problem, and we need to have some sort of help by the state. I don't know if it's a statutory issue or if there's some way we can help these localities getting in permitting into those localities.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Speaker 1.
Yes, I'm Tim Blake with the Emerald Cup, and I can't encourage you enough to take up the event aspect of the regulation for cannabis. If you look throughout this world, you look at Europe with Amsterdam, and you look at Cannabis now, the big show in Spain. The Canadians have offered us to come up to Canada, and yet we're regulated to fairgrounds and small events here. They just had outside lands with 240,000 people in San Francisco. You could get high all over outside lands, but you couldn't get high in grasslands where the cannabis was. They're demonizing it and making us seem like we're not part of the regular industry. We're not black market anymore. We're medicinal. We're adult use. We need to bring events throughout this state and around this country. They're very serious events. We bring legislators, we bring doctors, we scientists, lawyers together at the Emerald Cup. We teach, we learn, we gather as community, and we really need to open up the events so that we can really take our rightful place in California. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 2.
Hi, my name's Taylor Blake. I'm the associate producer of the Emerald Cup. My dad's going to make me do the specific commenting on the event stuff. So for next meeting, if we can have the event topic on the agenda, 2 things that we think would be really important to cover would be the event regulations appear to have been adapted from the retail sales regulations, eliminating the opportunity for consumers to interact with and learn about how their cannabis was produced. We respectfully request that the BCC look to the wine industry for guidance in this instance. There's a big difference between a retail experience and those at wine tastings facilities or auctions. Event regulations should emulate these event examples. Please consider broadening the scope of activities and consumer interaction at licensed events. And the second thing would be the proposed permanent regulations appear to require not only a list of cannabis vendors participating in the temporary cannabis event, but also a list of the vendors' employees that will be working at the event. Requiring the cannabis event organizer to produce a vendor staff list 60 days prior in writing is a monumental task. We respectfully request that the BCC allow event organizers to provide or make available a list of all vendor staff working the event the day of the event, after vendors and their staff have picked up their credentials. Thank you all so much for your time. Thanks.
Thank you. Speaker 3.
Thank you. Max McClellan with K Street Consulting. I want to ask for 2 items to be agendized for future meetings. The first one being potential issues around track and trace, metric BCC section 5050. The very final subdivision of 5050 indicates that if there is a lack of access to metric by a licensee, that they cannot transfer, transport, sell, or essentially interact with any licensees or consumers as that commercial cannabis business. That might have been intended for an individual outage by a business losing access to metric. My concern is on a system-wide outage basis, and what happens to California's cannabis industry if metric itself goes down. It's been crippled in Maryland and elsewhere, and so I think that it's a concern we need to be talking about and a regulation we need to be looking at in all 3 sets of regs. Secondly, I would like to address or highlight the concern around phase 3 testing and what the heavy metals implications there are, combined with whatever the new packaging and labeling requirements are that would come out effective December 6th, 2018. There simply will not be enough time to adapt to especially changes in packaging and labeling regulations that are released with the final permanent regulations. Between that time then to redesign packaging, and that then pushes weeks worth of products into phase 3 testing, creating a backlog and recreating July 1, which we want to avoid. Thank you.
Speaker 1.
Randy Dezitzer from Cannabis. Wanted to propose 2 items for future agendas. The first one is expanding delivery hours for cannabis delivery companies. Again, just to reflect the unique work hours that we all face nowadays, and where some of us cannot get home within the delivery windows that are currently allowed. The other item to add to the agenda in the future is also expanding the scope for events. I think events are a great way for individuals to learn about the plant, the companies, the brands, the producers, manufacturers, etc. Right now they're obviously fairly limited to public fairgrounds and whatnot, so expanding the scope to allow more events throughout the state would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Speaker 2.
John Brower from Trinity County again, and I love how you guys opened up a future agenda to take another look at microbusiness and especially how it might fit into rural counties. I'd also like to have distribution transport only and self-distribution, and now this new distribution, transporter, and storage license type opened up, and I think we need to all kind of take a better look at it and suss it out a little better. The transport element of this in particular is crucial with harvest season weeks away. Up in the Emerald Triangle, it's the bottleneck right now, and even if there were to be some temporary first year, second year means of allowing greater opportunities for self-transport would really help get this supply chain moving right when it needs to. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we're getting to that part of the afternoon where we're just taking any other general public comments. Does anybody else have anything left to say? I'm sure. Good. Hello?
6th bite of the apple?
Absolutely.
Very quickly. Thank you very, very much for opening this up and making us feel a little more hopeful than we were just a couple of days ago. What I want to ask you is to please be mindful of the time constraints that we are all under as small operators. Many of us, obviously, have had to suspend all operations. And driving up Highway 101 going north, there are properties for sale on the left and the right. Real estate agents are telling buyers, just hold off another year or so when the price really drops and they're really desperate. Many people in the northern counties particularly cannot forego another season. So please be mindful. We know how busy you all are and we appreciate your time, but please be aware that despite the apocryphal stories, there are no people with $500,000 buried in the backyard. A lot of people are just hanging on. A lot of land has already been sold, and without the land, we cannot continue as medicine makers, as small operators, as farmers, as we have for generations. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, seeing no other comments, I just have one quick one. Our next meeting is going to be September 20th in Eureka. And last opportunity for a public hearing on the regulatory framework is going to be held here in Sacramento, different location. Library Galleria downtown on the 27th. And that is also the last day for public comment to be submitted to the Bureau on the final regs. With that, we'll go ahead and adjourn this meeting, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.